Hello everyone, and welcome back to Mr. Sleepy Crime. I know many of you enjoy listening to these stories as you fall asleep. So before you drift off, I'd love for you to leave a comment letting me know where in the world you're tuning in from. And if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and subscribe. It really helps the channel grow. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge that this story involves real people and real tragedies. We tell these stories not for entertainment, but to remember the victims and perhaps help others recognize the warning signs that could prevent similar tragedies. For the best experience, feel free to lower the volume a little, just enough to let the story gently carry you off to sleep. Alright, please get comfortable, dim the lights, and let's dive into tonight's first story. Tonight we're going to explore a case that shook Australia to its core in 2024. This is the story of Anna Kemp, a devoted mother from New Zealand, her young daughter Gracie, and the man who should have protected them both. As we settle in, let me tell you about the case that would earn one man the chilling nickname, the Mornington Monster. This is a story about hidden darkness, about deception, and about a crime so calculated that it left investigators questioning how anyone could commit such acts against their own family. Mornington is a quiet, semi-rural suburb on the outskirts of Melbourne, Australia, the kind of place where people know their neighbors, where children play in backyards, and where life moves at a gentle pace. In the early 1990s, this peaceful town was home to John Miles Sharp, born on February 28, 1967. John grew up in Mornington alongside his 4 older sisters and a younger brother. His parents, Valerie and Miles, ran a local shop. By all accounts, John's childhood was unremarkable. He was a quiet boy who struggled socially, someone who relied heavily on his parents well into adulthood. Teachers noticed he had difficulty handling stress, and his emotional intelligence seemed somehow stunted. Still, nothing about young John Sharp suggested the horror that would eventually unfold. After completing his final year of school, though he didn't pass his exams, John found work at the state bank. Later, he moved to the Commonwealth Bank of Australia, working as a bank employee in the local branch. It was there, in the ordinary setting of bank tellers and customer service, that he met Anna Kemp. Anna was 4 years older than John, a New Zealand native with a warm smile and a practical nature. She was responsible, hard-working, and well-liked by her colleagues. The relationship developed quickly, perhaps too quickly. Within a year of meeting, John and Anna were married in October 1994. But almost immediately, cracks began to show. Anna confided in her mother shortly after the honeymoon. "I think I've made a mistake," she said quietly. Her brother would later recall that Anna felt there was no passion, no real love in the marriage, but Anna was practical, perhaps too practical. She decided to make the best of the situation. She carried on with what she called the mistake, hoping that time and commitment might build what passion had failed to create. For nearly a decade, John and Anna moved around the Mornington Peninsula, settling in various locations, trying to build a life together. John left banking and became a self-employed conveyancer, handling property transactions and legal documents. The work was solitary, which suited his personality. Anna continued working until they decided to start a family. In August 2002, their daughter was born. They named her Gracie Louise Sharp, a beautiful baby girl who should have brought joy into their struggling marriage. But Gracie was born with hip dysplasia, a congenital condition where the hip socket is too shallow to properly support the hip joint. The condition required immediate medical intervention. For the first 3 months of her life, Gracie had to wear a corrective harness, a rigid contraption that kept her tiny legs in position to allow her hips to develop properly. It was uncomfortable for the infant, and she cried often. Her parents got very little sleep during those early months. Even after the harness was removed, Gracie continued to struggle. She had difficulty feeding, and sleep remained elusive for the troubled child. Anna sought professional help repeatedly, taking Gracie to specialists and therapists. Desperate to ease her daughter's discomfort, she was a devoted mother, the kind who would do anything for her child. But for John, Gracie's struggles were something else entirely. He saw them as an inconvenience, a burden. The crying, the sleepless nights, the constant medical appointments. They all wore on him. Rather than bringing the couple together, their daughter's challenges drove a wedge deeper between them. In 2003, John purchased something unusual, a high-powered spear gun, and an additional spear from a local sporting goods store called Sport Philip Marine in Mornington. This was odd because John had never shown any interest in spearfishing. He had never gone diving, never talked about wanting to try the sport. Yet there he was, buying professional spearfishing equipment. He took the spear gun home and practiced with it in the backyard, firing it again and again, learning how it worked, becoming familiar with its weight and power. His neighbors might have heard the distinctive sound of the spear being released, the sharp thwack as it hit whatever target he'd set up, but they thought nothing of it. Just John trying a new hobby, they probably assumed. Then in November 2003, when Gracie was about 15 months old, Anna discovered she was pregnant again. She was delighted. She wanted Gracie to have a sibling, someone to grow up with. She had even chosen a name for the baby boy she was carrying, Francis. For John, the news was devastating. He later told police that the pregnancy came as a complete surprise, that he had decided one child was enough of a burden. He didn't want another baby. He didn't want to deal with more crying, more sleepless nights, more stress, and so in the quiet of his own mind, resentment began to build. Resentment toward Anna, resentment toward the unborn child, resentment toward the life he felt trapped in. March 21st, 2004 was a pleasant day. The Sharp family attended a birthday party for John's nephew. Friends and family gathered, children played, and everyone seemed happy. Those who were there later told police they noticed nothing unusual. John and Anna didn't argue. There was no tension between them. They appeared to be just another married couple at a family gathering. 2 days later, on March 23rd, everything changed. According to John's later confession, he and Anna had an argument that evening before bed. It wasn't anything major, just one of those everyday disagreements that married couples have. They went to bed sometime between 9 and 10 o'clock. Anna, exhausted from her day and her pregnancy, fell asleep almost immediately. But John lay awake in the darkness. He thought about the argument. He thought about his marriage, about Anna, about Gracie's constant needs, about the baby that was coming. His mind churned with resentment and rage that he had been building for months, perhaps years. After some time had passed, with Anna sleeping soundly beside him, John got out of bed. He walked through the quiet house, out the back door, and into the garage. He knew exactly what he was looking for. The spear gun, the one he had practiced with, the one he knew how to use. He picked it up, loaded it, and walked back into the house. Back up the stairs, back into the bedroom where his pregnant wife lay sleeping. John stood at the edge of the bed and aimed the spear gun at Anna's left temple from just a few centimeters away. Then he pulled the trigger. The spear penetrated her skull with tremendous force. Anna's body jerked, but she was still breathing. Her brain, even with a spear embedded in it, was still trying to keep her alive. John, seeing this, reloaded the spear gun with the second spear he had purchased. He fired again, this time ensuring the job was complete. Anna died in her sleep, never knowing what had happened, never able to defend herself or her unborn child. John covered her body with towels, hiding the gruesome sight of what he had done. Then, with his wife lying dead in their bedroom, he went downstairs and settled onto the fold-out sofa bed, and he slept. The next morning, March 24th, John woke up in his home with his wife's body upstairs and his young daughter Gracie asleep in her crib. He tried to remove the spears from Anna's head, but the barbed tips were designed to hold fast. He managed to unscrew the shafts, leaving the spearheads buried deep in her skull. Then John did something that showed remarkable composure for someone who had just committed murder. He went about his day as if nothing had happened. He took Gracie to daycare, dropping her off with a smile and a wave to the staff. He ran errands. He acted completely normal. That evening, he dug a shallow grave in the backyard and buried Anna's body. It was dark and the neighbors saw nothing. For the next few days, John continued his charade. He kept taking Gracie to daycare, kept going about his business, but he began to plant seeds of a story. He told the daycare workers that he and Anna had separated, that Anna had left him. He said Gracie wouldn't be attending daycare much longer because Anna would be picking her up soon. He called Anna's mother in New Zealand and told her the same story. Anna had left him for another man, he said. She had been having an affair, and she'd moved out. He didn't know where she was, but he expected she would come get Gracie within the week. He had to take Gracie with him to buy more spears at the sporting goods store. Additional ammunition for what he had already decided would come next. 4 days after killing his wife, on March 27, 2004, John put Gracie to bed in her crib as usual. The little girl, just 20 months old, settled down for sleep in her familiar room, surrounded by her toys, safe in the routine her mother had established for her. Downstairs, John poured himself several glasses of whiskey mixed with Coke. He drank them steadily, methodically. Later, he would tell police he was trying to numb his senses for what he was about to do. When he felt sufficiently anesthetized by alcohol, John retrieved the spear gun from the garage once again. He loaded it with one of the new spears he had purchased and walked upstairs to Gracie's room. He stood over his daughter's crib. Gracie was asleep, vulnerable, trusting. She was the child he had resented for her medical problems, for her crying, for the burden he felt she represented. And according to his own chilling words, she had to die because the child belongs with the mother. John aimed the spear gun at his daughter's head and fired. But unlike Anna, Gracie didn't die immediately. The shot penetrated her skull, but the little girl began to scream, wounded, in unimaginable pain. She cried out in the darkness of her bedroom. John, hearing her screams, retrieved the 2 spear shafts he had removed from Anna's head days earlier. He loaded them into the gun and returned to Gracie's room. He fired again and again. Gracie was still alive, still suffering. He had to fire a 4th time before his daughter finally fell silent. 4 shots to kill a toddler. 4 times he loaded the spear gun and fired at his own child. The next morning, John returned to Gracie's room. He covered his own face with a towel because he couldn't bear to look at what he had done. He removed the spears from her head, wrapped her small body in garbage bags, secured everything with duct tape, and set her aside. On March 29th, John took a trip to the local Bunnings hardware store in Frankston. He walked through the aisles calmly, selecting items: a roll of duct tape, 2 tarpaulins, and an electric chainsaw. He paid for them and drove home. The following day, March 30th, John dug up Anna's body from the backyard. It had been buried for nearly a week. Using the chainsaw he had purchased, he dismembered her remains, cutting her body into 3 pieces. The sound of the chainsaw would have been loud, but if neighbors heard anything, they assumed he was doing yard work. He wrapped the pieces in the tarpaulins, secured them with duct tape, and loaded everything into his vehicle along with Gracie's bagged body and the chainsaw itself. He drove to the Mornington transfer station, the local dump, and tossed ordinary-looking blue garbage bags into the waste bins. Among the thousands of bags of household trash, Anna and Gracie disappeared. But John's performance was just beginning. That same day, he used Anna's email account to send messages to her family in New Zealand. Pretending to be Anna, he wrote that she had left John for another man, that she was pregnant by this new man, and that she was happy. The emails were meant to reassure her family, to buy him time. Instead, they had the opposite effect. Anna's family knew her well. They knew she would never abandon Gracie, would never run off without a word to her mother. The emails felt wrong, the tone wasn't Anna's, and the story made no sense. Anna's mother reported her daughter as missing to police in Dunedin, New Zealand on March 29th. John kept up his act with remarkable dedication. He arranged for flowers to be delivered to his mother-in-law on her birthday, signing Anna's name. He called Anna's family again, telling them that Gracie was now with Anna in a bigger and better place, a phrase that seemed almost taunting in its double meaning. When New Zealand police received the missing person report, they followed protocol and contacted John. He told them the same story. Anna had left him for another man and had taken Gracie with her, but something didn't sit right with the New Zealand investigators. They contacted Victoria Police in Australia, requesting they conduct inquiries. On May 20th, 2004, police from the Mornington station visited John at his home. He was calm, cooperative, and told them the same story. Anna had left voluntarily on March 23rd. He had no idea where she was, but the detectives were trained to spot inconsistencies. And there were many. Where were the bus tickets, plane tickets, hotel reservations? How had Anna left Mornington? Where was the evidence of this alleged affair? Her bank account showed minimal activity. Her phone had barely been used. Friends and family insisted Anna would never have left Gracie. The case was escalated to Victoria's Missing Persons Unit, and Detective Narelle Fraser took the lead. She and her team began to dig deeper. They interviewed John again on June 10th at the Mornington police station. He stuck to his story, showing no emotion when describing how his wife had supposedly abandoned their family. The detectives found his demeanor strange, too calm, too controlled. After that interview, police put John under covert surveillance. They watched him for days, documenting his movements, and then they witnessed something crucial. They saw John go to a public restroom in Mornington and retrieve something from a hiding place behind the toilet, a plastic bag containing Anna's credit card and phone. Later, they watched him dispose of potential evidence in a garbage bin at Mount Martha. This was the break they needed. On June 22, 2004, police arrested John Sharp and brought him to the Homicide Squad offices at St. Kilda Road for questioning. The first interview lasted hours. John sat across from detectives, maintaining his composure, continuing to deny any knowledge of Anne and Gracie's whereabouts. He showed no emotion, no concern for his missing family, no anxiety about being questioned for murder. Detective Fraser would later describe him as a closed book, someone who revealed nothing of his inner thoughts or feelings. The detectives knew they needed a different approach. They had evidence, surveillance footage of John retrieving Anna's credit card and disposing of items. They showed this footage to John's parents, Valerie and Miles Sharp, explaining what their son had done. Then they sent his parents in to speak with him. That conversation lasted an hour. When John's parents emerged from the interview room, they were devastated, and John was finally ready to talk. In the second interview, John Sharp confessed to both murders. But the way he described what he had done shocked even experienced homicide detectives. Detective Fraser, watching from behind a two-way mirror, along with other investigators, would later say it was the most disturbing interview she had ever witnessed. To hear a man talk about murdering his wife, who was 3 months pregnant, that was hard enough, she recalled, tears in her eyes years later. But he said it with no emotion whatsoever. John told them everything. He described the argument before bed on March 23rd. He described retrieving the spear gun from the garage. He described shooting Anna twice in the head while she slept. He explained how he had buried her in the backyard, then later dug her up and dismembered her with a chainsaw. He described throwing her remains in the garbage at the local dump. He told them about Gracie, about drinking whiskey to numb himself, about the 4 shots it took to kill his daughter. He explained his reasoning with chilling simplicity. The child belongs with the mother. When asked about his motivation, John claimed Anna had been controlling and moody, that their marriage was unhappy, that he resented the pregnancy. He said he had been thinking of taking care of Gracie by myself. And just amongst all this madness, that's when I lost the plot. But some family members would later suggest a darker motive. They claimed John had a history of sexual abuse, that he had molested young relatives decades earlier. They believed Anna had discovered him abusing Gracie and that he killed them both to silence her. These allegations were never proven in court, but they cast an even more sinister shadow over the murders. With John's confession, police knew where to look. The Rockley Stone Waste Management Facility in Turarong, about 60 kilometers south of Melbourne. But knowing they were there and finding them were two very different things. In May 2004, the landfill became the site of one of the most extensive forensic searches in Australian history. The scene was apocalyptic. Hundreds of police officers in biohazard suits and heavy-duty masks combed through massive mounds of garbage. The dump contained tons of household waste, thousands upon thousands of bags, much of it contaminated with asbestos and other hazardous materials. They were looking for 2 ordinary blue garbage bags among countless others. The search was grueling, physically demanding, and emotionally devastating. Officers worked in rotating shifts, digging through layers of trash, examining every bag, dealing with the stench and the reality of what they were trying to find. Detective Fraser led the search with remarkable dedication. "I just knew I would find her," she later said. "It's an innate feeling I can't describe any better than that." On the 10th day of the search, Detective Fraser found Anna. She was 2 meters below the surface, her remains still wrapped in the tarpaulin John had used. Fraser sat with the bag, refusing to leave Anna's side until the crime scene technicians and the coroner arrived. "I couldn't bear the thought of her being alone in the tip without anyone with her," she explained. The following day, they found Gracie, her small body wrapped in garbage bags and duct tape, had been discarded like trash alongside some of her toys and the weapons that had ended her life. John Sharp pleaded guilty to both murders. There was no trial, no chance for him to claim innocence or temporary insanity. The evidence was overwhelming, and his own confession left no room for doubt. On August 5, 2005, Judge Justice Philip Cummins sentenced John Sharp to 2 consecutive terms of life imprisonment, with a non-parole period of 33 years. The judge's words captured the horror of the crimes. The nature and events of the crime were too awful to contemplate. John would not be eligible for parole until 2037, when he would be 70 years old. He was sent to prison, where he remains in protective custody due to the numerous threats on his life from fellow inmates. Even among criminals, those who hurt children are considered the lowest of the low. Anna and Gracie were buried together at Green Park Cemetery in Dunedin, New Zealand, under Anna's maiden name of Kemp. The headstone remembers not just Anna and Gracie, but also Francis, the unborn son who died with his mother, the family that should have been, all wiped out by the man who should have protected them. In the years since the murders, psychologists and criminologists have studied John Sharp's case extensively. He was diagnosed with avoidant personality disorder, a condition characterized by extreme social inhibition, feelings of inadequacy, and hypersensitivity to criticism. People with this disorder often avoid relationships in situations where they might face rejection or judgment. But millions of people have personality disorders and never hurt anyone. John Sharp made conscious choices. He purchased the spear gun months before the murders. He practiced using it. He planned Anna's death, then waited 4 days before killing Gracie. He carefully disposed of the bodies. He created an elaborate cover story. He appeared on television, giving emotional interviews, begging for information about his family's whereabouts while knowing they were dead by his own hand. Detective Fraser, who spent so much time on the case, offered her perspective. I don't think anybody would know how John felt about anything. He was a closed book. He was very insular. He was a loner. I don't think anybody apart from his parents understood how John felt about anything. He didn't show any emotion. He showed no personality. John's niece Amanda, speaking on behalf of family members who did not support him, issued a statement. John's crimes have stolen 3 beautiful and precious lives. We send our heartfelt condolences to Anna's family in New Zealand, whose pain and suffering is tremendous. The case became one of Australia's most notorious family murders. John Sharp earned the nickname the Mornington Monster, and the case has been featured in numerous documentaries, podcasts, and true crime books. It serves as a grim reminder that sometimes the greatest danger comes from those closest to us, from those who promise to love and protect us. Tonight's story is a difficult one, perhaps one of the darkest we'll ever cover. It's hard to comprehend how a father could do what John Sharp did. It's hard to understand how someone could murder their pregnant wife, and then, days later, systematically kill their toddler daughter. Anna Kemp was 41 years old when she died. She had traveled from New Zealand to Australia, built a life, married, and devoted herself to being a mother. Despite knowing her marriage was a mistake, she stayed and tried to make it work. She sought help for Gracie's medical problems. She got pregnant again with hope for the future. She fell asleep on March 23, 2004, never knowing it would be her last night alive. Gracie was just 20 months old, barely more than a baby. She had struggled with hip dysplasia, but she was getting better. She was learning to walk, to talk, to explore her world. She went to sleep on March 27th in her crib, in her own room, probably clutching a favorite toy, trusting that she was safe. And Francis, the unborn son, never got a chance at life at all. John Sharp is still alive, serving his sentence, while Anna, Gracie, and Francis are long gone. He took 3 lives, destroyed multiple families, and traumatized everyone involved in investigating and prosecuting the case. As you drift off to sleep tonight, remember Anna's devotion to her daughter. Remember Gracie's innocent smile. Remember the family that should have been, and perhaps take comfort in knowing that justice, however imperfect, was eventually served. The Mornington Monster is behind bars, where he belongs, where he will remain for decades to come. Anna and Gracie rest in peace in Dunedin, reunited in death, finally safe from the man who was supposed to love them. If this is your first time listening to one of our true crime stories, welcome to Mr. Sleepy Crime, where we explore these cases in a calm and respectful way. I also want to take a moment to appreciate my amazing subscribers who've been rocking with me. Thank you so much for your continued support. If you're still awake and listening, don't forget to drop a comment. Let me know where you're tuning in from and the current time in your corner of the world. Or just say something to let me know you're still here. And if you haven't already, be sure to like this video and subscribe so you don't miss our next true crime stories for sleep. Now let's move on to our second story. Story 2. Tonight we're going to explore a tragic story from East London, one that shook the British entertainment community and revealed how the darkest crimes can emerge from the most familiar places. So as we settle in, let me take you through the life and untimely death of Gemma McCluskey. This is a story about dreams, family, and a betrayal that no one saw coming. The story begins on a cold February morning in 1983. On the 5th day of that month, in the vibrant neighborhood of Shoreditch in East London, a baby girl came into the world. Her parents named her Gemma Rose Veronica McCluskey. Shoreditch, with its mix of working-class families and artistic souls, was the perfect backdrop for a girl who would grow up dreaming of the spotlight. Gemma grew up in a household that knew both love and struggle. Her father, Anthony McCluskey, worked as a builder, his hands rough from years of construction work. Her mother dedicated herself to raising the children, keeping their modest home together. Gemma had brothers, including Tony, who was 6 years her senior, and Danny. Despite the financial challenges that come with working-class life in London, the McCluskey children grew up surrounded by family, their Irish Catholic roots giving them a strong sense of community and faith. From an early age, Gemma showed something special. She had that spark, that indefinable quality that made people turn their heads when she entered a room. She wasn't just pretty, though, she was certainly that. She had personality in abundance, a confidence that couldn't be taught. Her father would later describe her as a great character, someone who lit up every room she walked into. Friends and family never heard a bad word about her. She was the kind of person who made life more interesting just by being there. As she grew into her teenage years, Gemma's passion for performing only intensified. Acting wasn't just a hobby or a passing fancy. It was her calling, her way of connecting with people, of telling stories that mattered, while other kids her age were still figuring out what they wanted to do with their lives. Gemma already knew. She wanted to be an actress. In 1997, when Gemma was just 14 years old, her persistence paid off. She landed her first professional role in a CBBC children's television series called No Sweat. She played a character named Janice, and while it wasn't a starring role, it was a beginning. For a teenage girl from Shoreditch, appearing on television was a dream come true. It proved she had what it took. It proved she belonged on screen. But that was just the opening act. The real opportunity came 3 years later, in the year 2000, when Gemma was 17 years old. She auditioned for one of Britain's most beloved institutions, a television show that had been running since 1985 and captured the hearts of millions of viewers every week. She auditioned for EastEnders. For those unfamiliar with British television culture, EastEnders is more than just a soap opera. It's a national treasure, a show that's been part of British life for decades. Set in the fictional East London borough of Walford, in a place called Albert Square, EastEnders follows the lives of working-class Londoners through their triumphs and tragedies, their loves and losses. Being cast in EastEnders wasn't just getting a job, it was joining a legacy. Gemma McCluskey landed the role of Carrie Skinner, and she must have felt like she'd won the lottery. Carrie was the great-niece of Ethel Skinner, a beloved character who had recently been written out of the show. Gretchen Franklin, who played Ethel, had been with EastEnders since its very first episode in 1985. Making her one of the show's most iconic figures. For Gemma to play a character connected to such a legendary figure was both an honor and a challenge. Carrie Skinner arrived in Albert Square in October 2000, and Gemma brought her to life with natural charm and authenticity. The character was written as a friend to Zoe Slater, played by Michelle Ryan, who was one of the show's rising stars. Carrie also became the girlfriend of Robbie Jackson, a long-running character played by Dean Gaffney. The chemistry between the actors was palpable. Gemma held her own alongside seasoned performers, proving she belonged there. Over the course of her time on the show, from October 2000 to February 2001, Gemma appeared in more than 40 episodes. That's not an insignificant number. She became a familiar face to millions of viewers who tuned in several times a week to follow the lives of the Albert Square residents. Carrie Skinner was fun. She was relatable. She had that spark that made viewers care about what happened to her. But as is often the case with soap opera contracts, Gemma's time on EastEnders came to an end. In March 21, Carrie Skinner left Albert Square. The character moved on, and so did Gemma. While some might have been disappointed, Gemma saw it as an opportunity. She was only 18 years old, and she'd already been on one of Britain's most watched television programs. The world was open to her. After leaving EastEnders, Gemma's career path took a different turn. The acting roles didn't come as frequently as she might have hoped. This is the reality for many actors, even those who've had their moment in the spotlight. The entertainment industry is notoriously fickle, and steady work is never guaranteed. But Gemma was resilient. She took jobs in pubs and clubs around Shoreditch, working as a barmaid. Those who knew her during this time remember her as the life and soul of every party. She was vibrant, outgoing, never afraid to speak her mind or make herself heard. She had that rare quality of being authentically, unapologetically herself. As Gemma moved into her late 20s, life had its ups and downs, as it does for everyone. She remained close to her family, particularly her father, Anthony. She lived in a flat on Pelter Street in Bethnal Green, a neighborhood not far from where she grew up. The flat belonged to her mother, and Gemma shared it with her older brother, Tony. Tony McCluskey was, by most accounts, a quiet man. He worked as a window cleaner, part of a team contracted to clean windows at the iconic Lloyd's building in central London. It was honest work, the kind that required showing up every day and putting in the hours. But Tony had his struggles. He was a heavy user of cannabis, particularly a potent variety known as skunk. He'd also used cocaine. His drug use was no secret to his family, and it had become a source of tension. Living with Tony wasn't always easy. The siblings, like many brothers and sisters who share close quarters, had their arguments. Gemma, with her outgoing personality and tendency to speak her mind, would become frustrated with Tony's behavior. The drug use bothered her. His lack of responsibility around the flat bothered her. Friends would later recall hearing them argue over the phone, Gemma's voice rising as she tried to get through to her brother. By early 2012, Tony was dealing with multiple stressors in his life. His mother was seriously ill in hospital, recovering from surgery to remove a brain tumor. She'd contracted MRSA, a dangerous bacterial infection, and her condition was grave. Tony had recently split from his long-term partner. He was worried about losing his job. He was, by his own later admission, losing weight, motivation, and sleep. The cannabis use had intensified, and he was becoming increasingly withdrawn. March 1, 2012 started as an ordinary day, or as ordinary as any day could be with all that weight pressing down. It was a Thursday. Earlier that day, Gemma had attended the grand opening of the Royal London Hospital in Whitechapel. She was seen there, smiling, social, being her usual vivacious self. It would be the last time many people would see Sia alive. What happened that evening would later be reconstructed from evidence, testimony, and the fragments of truth that emerged during the investigation. According to the account that would be presented in court, Tony had left the taps running in the bathroom sink at their mother's flat on Pelter Street. It seems like such a small thing, doesn't it? A sink left running, water overflowing, perhaps pooling on the floor, seeping into the rooms below. It's the kind of careless mistake that might warrant an annoyed conversation, perhaps a heated argument at worst. But this wasn't just about an overflowing sink. This was about months, perhaps years of accumulated frustration. This was about Gemma feeling like she was constantly cleaning up after her older brother, constantly having to be the responsible one while he drifted through life in a haze of cannabis smoke. This was about her feeling disrespected in her own mother's home, while their mother lay in a hospital bed. Around 8 o'clock that evening, Gemma entered a kebab shop. Security footage and witness statements would later confirm this. It was the last confirmed sighting of her in public. She must have returned home after that, back to the flat on Pelter Street, back to where Tony was waiting. What happened next, Tony McCluskey would claim, was a blur. He would later say that Gemma confronted him about the flooding, that she was furious, that she told him if he couldn't treat their mother's home with respect, he might have to leave. According to his account, the argument escalated. He said she became abusive, that she came at him with a knife. that he lost control. But the physical evidence would tell a different story. The prosecution would later argue that what happened wasn't a momentary loss of control. What happened was murder. Gemma was struck over the head, at least twice, with a blunt instrument. The blows were forceful enough to kill her. Whatever Tony used, whether it was something grabbed in the heat of the moment or something else, it caused fatal trauma to her skull. Gemma McCluskey, 29 years old, who had danced across television screens and lit up rooms with her presence, died in that flat on Pelter Street. But Tony didn't call for help. He didn't call an ambulance. He didn't call the police. Instead, over the next several hours, he did something that would reveal the calculated nature of what came next. He dismembered his sister's body. What Tony McCluskey did in those hours after Gemma's death is almost unimaginable in its horror. Using a meat cleaver and a knife, he systematically cut his sister's body into 6 pieces. The bathroom and kitchen would later show evidence of this grim work. Small droplets of blood that he'd attempted to clean but hadn't entirely succeeded in removing. The question that haunts this case is the same question that haunts many cases of familial violence. How does someone cross that line? How does a person go from being someone's brother to being their killer? And then to something even darker. The dismemberment wasn't done in a frenzy. It took time, deliberation, a certain grim determination to see it through. Tony found a suitcase. He placed Gemma's remains inside it. The next day, March 2nd, CCTV footage captured something that would later become crucial evidence. Tony McCluskey, carrying a heavy suitcase, could be seen making his way through the streets of East London. He hailed a taxi. The driver later reported that the suitcase seemed unusually heavy. But Tony gave no indication that anything was wrong. Tony took the suitcase to the Regent's Canal in Hackney, near Broadway Market. The canal runs through East London, its waters dark and still, bordered by towpaths where people walk and cycle. It was there, in those waters where locals fish and boaters navigate, that Tony disposed of his sister's body. He threw the suitcase into the canal, watching it sink beneath the surface. Then he went home. On March 3rd, 2 days after Gemma's death, Tony McCluskey walked into the Bethnal Green police station. He reported his sister missing. He told police officers that Gemma hadn't come home from work, that he was concerned about her well-being. He filled out a missing person report, providing details about when he'd last seen her, what she'd been wearing, where she might be. The police, dealing with a report of a missing 29-year-old woman, initially treated it as a low-priority case. Adults go missing all the time, sometimes by choice. They often turn up within a few days. There was no immediate reason to suspect foul play. But Gemma's friends and family didn't wait for the police to treat it seriously. They took to social media, particularly Twitter, using the hashtag #FindGemma to spread awareness of her disappearance. Former EastEnders actresses who had worked with her, including Natalie Cassidy, Martine McCutcheon, and Brooke Kinsella, tweeted about Gemma's disappearance, using their platforms to reach thousands of people. Brooke Kinsella understood the pain of losing someone to violence. Her own brother Ben had been murdered in 2008. She knew the agony of waiting, of hoping, of needing answers. Her tweets about Gemma carried that weight of experience. On March 5th, Gemma's cousins organized a search party. About 100 people gathered, fanning out across East and South London, distributing flyers, asking questions, hoping someone had seen something. These were people who loved Gemma, who couldn't accept that she'd just vanished without a trace. Tony McCluskey participated in some of these efforts. He played the role of the worried brother, the one desperate to find his missing sister. He gave interviews. He spoke to police again. He expressed confusion and concern. He gave false hope to family and friends who were clinging to the possibility that Gemma might still be alive. On March 6th, 5 days after Gemma disappeared, someone made a horrifying discovery. A person navigating a barge along the Regent's Canal in Hackney near Broadway Market noticed something in the water. It was a suitcase, partially submerged, clearly containing something heavy. When police retrieved it and opened it, they found the worst possible answer to the question of what had happened to Gemma McCluskey. Inside was a headless, limbless torso. The body had been in the water for days, but there was something that made identification possible. On the neck of the torso was a distinctive butterfly tattoo. It was Gemma. On March 9th, police formally announced that the body had been identified as Gemma McCluskey. The missing person case had become a murder investigation. The news sent shockwaves through the community, through the entertainment world, through everyone who had known and loved her. Police immediately focused on the last place Gemma had been seen, the flat on Pelter Street. On March 7th, they visited the home she'd shared with her mother and brother. They examined every room, looking for evidence. In the bathroom and kitchen, they found it. Small blood droplets, traces of what had happened there. A knife was missing from the kitchen. The evidence pointed to one person. The last person known to have seen Gemma alive. The person who lived with her, who had reported her missing, who had participated in searches while knowing full well what had happened to her. On March 10th, police arrested Tony McCluskey. He was charged with his sister's murder. When he appeared at Thames Magistrates Court on March 12th, the public got their first glimpse of the man accused of this horrific crime. He spoke only to confirm his name, address, and date of birth. He was remanded in custody at Brixton Prison. As spring turned to summer and summer to autumn, the investigation continued. The Regent's Canal, that seemingly peaceful waterway, became the site of repeated searches. Police divers went down into the murky water again and again, looking for more evidence, more pieces of Gemma. Over the following weeks, Gemma's arms and legs were recovered from the canal, found separately in different locations. Each discovery was another blow to the family, trying to come to terms with what had happened. This wasn't just murder. This was desecration. But one crucial piece remained missing: Gemma's head. Through all the searches in March, April, May, June, July, and August, her head wasn't found. It seemed possible it might never be recovered. Then on September 10th, more than 6 months after Gemma's death, police found it. In the same stretch of the canal where the torso had been discovered, there was Gemma's head. On September 12th, the Metropolitan Police confirmed the identity. Now the investigation was complete. All of Gemma's remains had been recovered. The physical evidence was there. The CCTV footage was there. The witness statements were there. The blood evidence from the flat was there. Everything pointed to one person, and that person was already in custody. The trial was scheduled for January 2013, almost a full year after Gemma's death. Before that could happen, there was another moment of grief for the family. On November 30th, 2012, 8 months after her body was first discovered, Gemma's funeral was held at St. Monica's Roman Catholic Church in Hoxton Square, East London. She was laid to rest at the City of London Cemetery. Her father, Anthony McCluskey, stood among the mourners, grieving not just the loss of his daughter, but the betrayal by his son. It's hard to imagine that depth of pain to lose a child to violence, and to know that another child was responsible. On January 14, 2013, the trial of Tony McCluskey began at the Old Bailey, the Central Criminal Court in London. The Old Bailey has been the site of some of Britain's most famous trials, and now it would be the venue where Tony McCluskey would answer for what he'd done to his sister. From the beginning, Tony's defense strategy was clear. He didn't deny killing Gemma. The evidence was too overwhelming for that. Instead, he pleaded guilty to manslaughter, arguing that he'd lost control during an argument. He claimed diminished responsibility. He said that the last thing he remembered was Gemma coming at him with a knife, and that he had no recollection of what happened after that point. His defense lawyer, Jeremy Dane QC, painted a picture of a man worn down by stress and abuse. He described Tony as a quiet, diligent worker who'd been increasingly struggling with problems. His mother was seriously ill. He'd recently broken up with his long-term partner. He feared losing his job, and according to the defense, he'd been subjected to months of volatile and abusive behavior from Gemma. The defense argued that on the night of March 1st, after the argument about the overflowing sink, something in Tony had snapped, that it was a momentary loss of control, not premeditated murder, that he'd been provoked beyond what a reasonable person could endure. But the prosecution, led by Crispin Aylett QC, wasn't buying it. They presented a very different picture of what had happened. Yes, Tony had been under stress. Yes, he'd been using drugs. Yes, the siblings had argued. But none of that justified or explained what he'd done. The prosecution focused on the brutality of the crime. And what came after? Gemma had been struck over the head at least twice with a blunt instrument that suggested intent to cause serious harm or death, not a momentary loss of control. And then there was what Tony did afterward. He spent hours dismembering Gemma's body with a meat cleaver and knife. That wasn't the action of someone in a dissociative state. That required sustained, deliberate effort. He then placed the remains in a suitcase, took a taxi to the canal, and disposed of the evidence. The next day, he filed a false missing person report. In the days that followed, he gave false information to police. He participated in searches for Gemma while knowing exactly where she was. The judge would later note in his sentencing remarks that he unhesitatingly rejected Tony's account of being subjected to significant abuse from Gemma. The accounts Tony had given to police in early March, before he knew he was a suspect, contained none of the allegations of abuse he would later make. It appeared the judge suggested that the abuse claims had been constructed afterward to build a defense. The trial revealed other disturbing details. Friends of Gemma testified about the relationship between the siblings. Raif Minader, Gemma's childhood sweetheart, told the court that Tony had been obsessed with crime dramas, particularly shows like CSI and Dexter, and anything to do with serial killers. It was a chilling detail that suggested Tony might have had some idea of how to dispose of a body even before he'd done it. The jury heard testimony about Tony's heavy cannabis use, particularly his habit of smoking skunk, a particularly potent form of the drug. They heard about the tensions in the household, the arguments over Tony's behavior, Gemma's growing frustration with having to be the responsible one. They heard the pathologist's evidence about how Gemma died. Multiple blows to the head, trauma sufficient to cause death, a violent attack. After hearing all the evidence, after listening to the testimony, after examining the CCTV footage and the forensic reports and the witness statements, the jury retired to consider their verdict. They had to decide, was this murder or was this manslaughter? The distinction matters in English law. Murder requires an intention to kill or cause grievous bodily harm. Manslaughter can apply when someone kills without that intent, perhaps in the heat of passion or under provocation. Tony's defense was arguing for manslaughter based on loss of control. The prosecution was arguing that the evidence showed clear intent and premeditation. On January 30th, 2013, almost 11 months after Gemma's death, the jury reached their decision. By a majority verdict of 11-1, they found Tony McCluskey guilty of murder. The courtroom must have been heavy with emotion as the verdict was read. For Gemma's family and friends, it was vindication, justice for her death, acknowledgement that what had happened to her was the worst kind of crime. For Tony, it meant facing the full weight of the law. The judge, Mr. Justice Fulford, sentenced Tony McCluskey to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 20 years. In his sentencing remarks, the judge made clear his view of what had happened. Tony had killed Gemma because she was furious with him for letting the sink overflow, against a background of long-standing family tensions. The judge accepted that Gemma had expressed anger at Tony, and warned him that if he didn't treat their mother's home with more respect, he might have to leave. But the judge rejected Tony's claims that Gemma had used significant foul language, belittled him, or threatened him. The judge noted that Tony had used all means possible to divert suspicion away from himself, giving false hope to family and friends even as he knew what he'd done. Alison Saunders, the chief Crown prosecutor for CPS London, released a statement after the verdict. She called it an extremely distressing and violent case. She noted that McCluskey had used every tool at his disposal to avoid detection, including filing a false missing person report and giving false information to police. The message was clear. The justice system had seen through Tony's claims and held him accountable for murder. Tony McCluskey was initially imprisoned at Belmarsh Prison in London, in a segregated area for his own protection. In prison culture, those who harm family members, particularly women and children, are at the bottom of the hierarchy. Tony received threats from other inmates. His safety became a concern. In 2016, he was transferred to Lodham Grange Prison in Nottingham. A Ministry of Justice spokesman confirmed the move, noting that people could be transferred for various reasons, including being closer to family or for security purposes. The implication was clear: Tony needed to be moved for his own safety. For the McCluskey family, the aftermath of the trial was a time of painful reckoning. Anthony McCluskey, Gemma's father, had to navigate the impossible situation of grieving for his murdered daughter, while having a son in prison for her murder. For a time, he tried to maintain contact with Tony, to support him despite what he'd done. But in 2017, 4 years after the conviction, Anthony made a decision that must have been agonizing. He disowned Tony, speaking during an episode of the television documentary Crimes That Shook Britain. Anthony explained what had led to this decision. He's not showing no remorse, not an ounce of remorse, Anthony said. He doesn't mention her name. I'm trying to support and look after him, but he's not showing no remorse. And that was it. In the end, I went, I've had enough, Tony. It was the lack of remorse that Anthony couldn't bear. If Tony had shown genuine sorrow for what he'd done, genuine acknowledgement of the life he'd taken, perhaps Anthony could have maintained some relationship with him. But without that, the bond between father and son was severed. The case attracted significant media attention over the years. In 2017, Crimes That Shook Britain covered Gemma's murder. In 2018, an episode of Evidence of Evil examined the case. In 2019, Channel 5 broadcast a documentary called The EastEnders Murders: True Crime, Real Tragedy, which looked at Gemma's case alongside that of Sheann Blake, another former EastEnders actress who was murdered by her partner. These documentaries served a purpose beyond entertainment. They kept Gemma's memory alive. They reminded people of the dangers that can exist within families, behind closed doors, in places where we should feel safest. They also highlighted the painstaking detective work that had solved the case, the way investigators had pieced together evidence to ensure justice was served. As we reach the end of Gemma's story, it's worth reflecting on what it tells us about family, violence, and the fragility of life. Gemma McCluskey was a young woman with talent, with friends who loved her, with a family who cared about her. She'd achieved something many aspiring actors never do. She'd made it onto television, into millions of homes, into the cultural consciousness. But her life was cut short at 29, in the place where she should have been safest, by the person who should have been her protector. Brothers are supposed to protect their sisters, not harm them. Families are supposed to be sources of support and love, not danger and death. The case raises uncomfortable questions about domestic violence and familial abuse. How many times had Tony and Gemma argued before that fatal night? How long had the tensions been building? Were there warning signs that others missed or ignored? Could anything have been done differently? We know that Tony was struggling. His drug use, his stress about his mother's illness, his relationship breakdown, his job worries. These were real problems. But millions of people face similar challenges without turning to violence. The vast majority of people who use drugs, who experience stress, who have family conflicts, never hurt anyone. What happened on March 1st, 2012, was a choice. Tony McCluskey made a choice to strike his sister. He made a choice to continue striking her until she died. And then he made a series of choices about what to do with her body, how to cover up what he'd done, how to deceive everyone who cared about her. The lack of remorse that Anthony McCluskey spoke about is perhaps the most chilling aspect of the whole case. It suggests that even after being convicted, even after being imprisoned, Tony never fully confronted what he'd done. He never fully acknowledged the magnitude of taking his sister's life, of robbing her of her future, of causing immeasurable pain to everyone who loved her. And so we come to the end of Gemma's story, though not the end of her memory. She lives on in the episodes of EastEnders where you can still see her, forever 29, forever vibrant on screen. She lives on in the memories of those who knew her, who remember her laugh, her spirit, her presence. The waters of the Regent's Canal continue to flow through East London, past the spot where Gemma's body was discovered. People walk along the towpath, unaware of the tragedy that unfolded there. The flat on Pelter Street stands as it always has, just another building on an East London street. But for those who knew Gemma, for those who loved her, the absence is permanent. There are no more phone calls, no more late-night conversations, no more shared memories being created. There's only the past, frozen in time, and the knowledge of what should have been. Tony McCluskey remains in prison, serving his minimum 20-year sentence. If he serves only the minimum, he'll be eligible for parole in 2032. He'll be in his mid-50s. He'll have missed decades of life. Decades he took from his sister. Whether he ever truly understands what he did, whether he ever develops the remorse that his father wanted to see, whether he ever speaks his sister's name with the weight of what he took from her, that remains to be seen. But Gemma McCluskey, the girl from Shoreditch who dreamed of being an actress, who made it onto one of Britain's most beloved television programs, who lit up rooms with her presence, she is gone. Taken not by accident, not by illness, not by any of the random cruelties that life can throw at us. but by the deliberate actions of someone who was supposed to love her. That is the tragedy at the heart of this story. That is what makes it so difficult to comprehend and so important to remember. Rest in peace, Gemma McCluskey. February 5th, 1983 to March 1st, 2012. 29 years old, forever remembered. Please, if you're still awake, drop a candle. I want to see who's still with me. Also, don't forget to tell me where you're listening from, the time in your corner of the world, and maybe share one thing you've learned from tonight's stories. Meanwhile, let's move on to our third story. Story 3. There are places in America where life moves at a gentle pace, where neighbors know each other's names, where children ride bicycles down tree-lined streets, and where the biggest excitement might be a high school baseball game on a Saturday afternoon. Grovetown, Georgia was one of those places. Nestled about 2 hours east of Atlanta, just north of Augusta, Grovetown in 2009 was home to roughly 6,000 souls. It was the kind of town where people moved to escape the chaos of bigger cities, where they could raise their families in peace, where the American dream still felt within reach. The Orchard Hills subdivision embodied everything Grovetown promised. Manicured lawns, two-story homes with wraparound porches, and a genuine sense of community that seemed almost old-fashioned in its warmth. On Hot Springs Drive, two families lived side by side. Their lives so intertwined that to neighbors they seemed like one extended family. To anyone watching, they were the picture of suburban harmony. But beneath the surface of backyard barbecues and shared carpool duties, something dark was taking root. Something that would shatter not just two families, but an entire community's sense of safety. This is the story of Kay Parsons, a woman who believed in the goodness of people, who welcomed a neighbor into her life as a friend, never imagining that friendship would cost her everything. Laverne Catherine Sanner was born on February 11, 1968 in Connellsville, Pennsylvania, to Arthur and Mabel Sanner. From the beginning, everyone called her Kay. She grew up in the rolling hills of Fayette County, in the small communities of Dunbar and Hopwood, where life revolved around family, church, and high school sports. Kia was the kind of person people gravitated toward. She had an adventurous spirit, always the first to try something new, always laughing. Her sisters Olive Elma, and Mary and her brothers Kenneth, Charles and Arthur Jr., would later remember her as the glue that held their close-knit family together. She was never upset, never angry, just always smiling, always present. In high school, Kay fell in love with her sweetheart, David Parsons. He was from Hopwood, too, a young man with military ambitions and a steady nature that complemented Kay's vibrant personality. After graduation in 1987, they married, ready to build a life together. David joined the Army, and Kay followed him from base to base, the way military wives do. She built homes in temporary places, made friends she'd have to leave behind, and supported David's career without complaint. In 1996, they welcomed their son Derek, and Kay found her true calling. She was a natural mother, patient, encouraging, endlessly enthusiastic about every milestone, every achievement. By the time Derek was approaching his teenage years, David had retired from active military service and taken a civilian contractor position working for the government at Fort Gordon in Augusta, Georgia. The pay was good, the work was stable, and in 2005 the Parsons family made their final move to Grovetown. They bought a beautiful home at 229 Hot Springs Drive in the Orchard Hills subdivision. It was everything they'd worked for. A real ranch-style house with a garage, a backyard perfect for Derek's baseball practice, and neighbors who waved from their front porches. Kay found work at Healing Hands Physical Therapy, where her warm personality made her a favorite among patients. Life was good. Life was safe. Derek was 12 now, passionate about baseball, and involved in multiple leagues. Kay never missed a game. She was that mom. The one in the stands cheering the loudest, organizing team snacks, making sure every kid felt special. She and David were devoted to their son. Everything they did as a family. Neighbors would see them together constantly, riding motorcycles, going to Derek's games, just existing in that easy rhythm that happy families have. Kay made friends easily in Grovetown. One friendship in particular seemed especially close. Right next door at 27 Hot Springs Drive lived Rebecca Sears. Becky to everyone who knew her. Becky Sears seemed like Kay's perfect match as a friend. She was also 41, outgoing and friendly, the kind of woman who knew everyone in the neighborhood and organized social gatherings. She was married to Tony Sears, who also had a military background, creating common ground between the two families. Becky had a complicated family situation. She had 5 children, 2 sons, Michael and Christopher, from a previous relationship, and 3 more children with Tony. Michael, the oldest, was in his early 20s and struggled with employment and substance abuse issues. He still lived at home, which created its own tensions. Christopher, 19, seemed more stable. He had his own place and worked part-time at Healing Hands Physical Therapy, where his mother had gotten him a job. The same place where Kay worked. The Parsons and Sears families quickly became inseparable. They went on double dates, took vacations together, attended Weight Watchers meetings as a group. When Kay and Becky weren't at work, they were often at each other's houses, sharing coffee and conversation. To their neighbors, they were best friends. Their children played together. Their husbands grilled together on weekends. It was the kind of friendship that makes a neighborhood feel like a community. Tamara Baldwin, who lived down the street, thought Kay and Becky were wonderful. She'd see Kay outside, always smiling, always stopping to chat. The whole neighborhood seemed to revolve around these friendly, normal families, doing friendly, normal things. But friendship, like everything else in life, can be a mask. And sometimes the people we trust most are the ones hiding the darkest secrets. Wednesday, March 25th, 2009 started like any other day for Kay Parsons. David was out of town on business in California, which happened fairly often with his contractor work. Kay was used to managing on her own when he traveled. She woke up, got Derek ready for school, and dropped him off around 7:15 that morning. After dropping Derek off, Kay stopped at McDonald's for breakfast, a small treat for herself before heading to work. She arrived back home at approximately 8:30, pulling into her driveway with her breakfast and her purse, ready to grab a few things before heading to Healing Hands. She never made it to work. Around 9 o'clock that morning, a handyman named Mitchell, who had been hired to do some work on Kay's house, arrived at 29 Hot Springs Drive. He knocked on the front door. No answer. He tried calling out. Still nothing. That was strange. Kay had specifically scheduled him to come that morning. Mitchell walked around to the side of the house, and that's when he noticed something that made his stomach drop. The glass in the back door was shattered. Pieces glittered on the ground, and the door stood slightly ajar. His first thought was to check if Kay was okay. He stepped inside, calling her name. The house felt wrong immediately. There were signs of disturbance. Things knocked over. Drawers pulled open. A sense of violation hung in the air. Mitchell followed a trail of blood drops that led from the kitchen through the house. His heart pounded as he reached the garage. What he saw there would haunt him forever. Kay Parsons lay on the concrete floor, surrounded by a pool of blood. Near her body were 2 weapons, a baseball bat and a claw hammer. She'd been beaten with savage brutality, her skull fractured in multiple places, her face unrecognizable, but impossibly, incredibly, she was still alive. Mitchell could see the faint rise and fall of her chest, the weak flutter of a pulse. He ran outside and called 911, his hands shaking so badly he could barely hold the phone. Deputies from the Columbia County Sheriff's Office arrived within minutes. Staff Sergeant Jimmy Edmonds was among the first on scene, and he'd been in law enforcement for years. He'd seen violence, seen death, seen the worst of what people could do to each other. But what happened to Kay Parsons shook him. "I've never seen someone beaten this bad," he would later say. Paramedics rushed Kay to the hospital, but the doctors were grim. The injuries to her brain were catastrophic. She was alive, but barely, and the prognosis was bleak. Back at the house, investigators began processing the scene. It appeared to be a burglary gone wrong. The back door had been smashed in. Drawers were rifled through. A gold necklace and an expensive watch were missing. Items that would be easy to sell. The baseball bat used in the attack belonged to Derek, taken from the garage. The hammer appeared to have been brought by the intruder, but something didn't add up. The level of violence was extreme for a burglary. Most burglars want to get in and out quickly. They don't stick around to beat someone to death when they could just run. And there was something else, a detail that would prove crucial. As investigators examined the neighboring property, they discovered that the Sears house at 2207 Hot Springs Drive had also been burglarized that same morning. Tony and Becky Sears returned home to find their back door handle marked with a smudge of blood. Someone had been inside, though nothing major seemed to be taken. The same perpetrator hitting two houses right next to each other. It was unusual, risky. Investigators began to wonder if there was some connection they weren't seeing yet. Becky Sears, when she learned what happened to Kay, rushed to the hospital. She was distraught, crying, desperate to see her best friend. The hospital staff and Kay's family allowed her to visit. She sat by Kay's bedside, holding her hand, talking to her unconscious friend. On March 26th, after consulting with medical staff, David Parsons made the most difficult decision of his life. The doctors had no confidence Kay would recover. Her brain damage was too severe. With Derek by his side, David made the choice to remove Kay from life support. Kay Parsons died the next morning. The investigation was now a homicide. Sergeant Edmonds and his team had their work cut out for them. They started with the obvious suspects. The handyman Mitchell, who discovered the body. They brought him in for questioning. Went through his story again and again, checked his background. He came up clean. There was no evidence connecting him to the crime beyond being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Next, they looked at what they called frequent flyers, known offenders in the area who committed burglaries. Greektown was a small town, and the sheriff's office knew who the troublemakers were. One name kept coming up: Michael Sears, Becky's oldest son. Michael had a history. He'd been arrested multiple times for burglaries. He had a drug problem. He'd been seen in the neighborhood that morning. When Sergeant Edmonds spoke with him outside the crime scene, he asked to see the bottom of Michael's shoes, and there it was, a shard of glass embedded in the sole of his sneaker. The forensics lab tested that glass fragment. It matched the broken glass from Kay Parsons' back door. Michael was brought in for intense questioning. He claimed he'd been home that morning, that he didn't know anything about what happened to Kay, but he was lying about his employment status, lying about his whereabouts. The investigators felt certain they had their man. But even as they focused on Michael, Sergeant Edmonds couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The pieces fit, but not quite right. The violence seemed too personal for a simple burglary. And there was still the question of why anyone would hit both houses. Then, 36 hours after Kay was attacked, something happened that changed everything. On the evening of March 26th, Becky Sears left her workplace at Healing Hands Physical Therapy in Augusta. It was dark, and she was walking to her car in the parking lot when, according to her frantic 911 call, a man emerged from the nearby woods. He pointed a gun at her and demanded money. When she said she didn't have any, he shot her in the leg and ran back into the woods. Disappearing into the darkness, another violent attack. Connected to the Parsons case, investigators rushed to the scene. Becky was taken to the hospital with a gunshot wound to her leg. Painful, but not life-threatening. She gave a description of her attacker, but it was vague. A man possibly living in the woods, desperate enough to shoot someone over money. Sergeant Edmonds stood in that parking lot, staring at the tree line, trying to make sense of it all. Two houses burglarized on the same street. The wife of one family beaten to death. The wife of the neighboring family shot. Was there a connection? Was someone targeting this neighborhood specifically? There's some kind of connection between these two houses, Edmonds thought. And I don't know what it is, but I'm missing something. His instincts were right, but the truth, when it came, would be far stranger and darker than anyone imagined. 2 days after Kay's attack, while investigators were still focused on Michael Sears and puzzling over Becky's shooting, Sergeant Edmonds received an unexpected phone call. The caller was Jerry Jacobs. He was currently incarcerated, and he had information about the case that he said detectives needed to hear. Jerry Jacobs was Becky Sears' brother. Edmonds met with Jerry, not sure what to expect. What Jerry told him turned the entire investigation on its head. According to Jerry, Becky had called him some months before, upset and emotional. She confessed to him that she was having an affair with David Parsons, Kay's husband. She was in love with him. She wanted to be with him, but Kay was in the way. Jerry said Becky had asked him if he knew anyone who could kill Kay and make it look like an accident. He'd refused, disturbed by the request, but the conversation stuck with him, and when he heard about Kay's murder, he knew he had to come forward. Edmonds felt the pieces finally starting to fall into place. An affair. A motive. Suddenly, the brutality of the attack made sense. This wasn't about robbery. This was about passion, jealousy, elimination of a rival. But if Becky wanted Kay dead, who actually did the killing? Jerry provided another crucial piece of information. He mentioned that if any of Becky's sons were involved, it would be Christopher, not Michael. Christopher, the 19-year-old who seemed stable, who had his own place, who worked with both his mother and Kay at the physical therapy clinic. Christopher, who everyone described as a mama's boy, but not in the normal way. His devotion to his mother, multiple people told investigators, was unusual, excessive. He would do anything for her, anything. Before they could move forward, investigators had to confirm Jerry's claim about the affair. They brought David Parsons in for questioning. David was still reeling from Kay's death, still trying to process the fact that his wife was gone. He was grieving, confused, and now he was being questioned like a suspect. At first, David denied it, but as the interview continued, as investigators pressed him with details they'd learned, he finally broke down. Yes, he admitted. He'd been having an affair with Becky Sears. It had been going on for some time. They'd gotten close because the families were so intertwined. It had started innocently, or so he told himself, but it had developed into something more. Recently, though, David had ended it. He realized what he was risking, realized the betrayal of Kay, of their family. He told Becky it was over. Becky, David said, had not taken it well. She was angry, hurt, desperate. She'd called him the night before Kay was attacked, begging him to reconsider. Investigators looked at David's alibi closely. He'd been in California on business phone records. Work schedules, hotel receipts all confirmed it. There was no way he could have been in Grovertown when Kay was killed, and nothing in the evidence suggested he'd hired anyone or knew what Becky was planning. David Parsons was cleared of involvement in his wife's murder, but now investigators knew the truth. Kay had died because of a love triangle she probably never even knew existed. With the affair confirmed and Jerry's statement on record, Sergeant Edmonds turned his attention to Christopher Bowers. They'd been so focused on Michael that they barely looked at the younger son. As they dug into Christopher's life, a disturbing picture emerged. Christopher didn't just love his mother. He was enmeshed with her in an unhealthy way. While he had his own apartment, he spent most of his time at Becky's house. She confided in him about everything, including her marital problems and her affair with David. When she was unhappy, Christopher was unhappy. When she had a problem, Christopher wanted to solve it. Becky had been giving Christopher money, bought him things, got him his job at the physical therapy clinic. But there was something else. According to Jerry and other witnesses, Becky had recently started giving Christopher prescription drugs, specifically Xanax. Christopher had developed a dependency on them, and Becky was his source. It was a form of control, investigators realized. Becky was using drugs, money and emotional manipulation to keep Christopher completely under her influence. Multiple witnesses came forward with chilling statements. Becky had told them she wished she knew someone who could kill someone for her. She'd said it casually, like she was wishing for help cleaning her house. One unidentified informant even claimed Becky had directly asked him to murder Kay. Becky hadn't just wanted Kay dead. She'd been actively looking for someone to do it for her. And she'd found someone, her own son. A young man she'd groomed and controlled so thoroughly that he would commit murder if she asked. On March 27th, investigators confronted Becky Sears directly. The interview room at the Columbia County Sheriff's Office was small, fluorescent-lit, uncomfortable. Becky Sears sat across from Sergeant Edmonds and other investigators. She was still recovering from her gunshot wound, still playing the role of victim, still acting shocked and grieving over Kay's death. But as the questions continued, as investigators laid out what they knew, the affair, the statements from witnesses, the timeline, Becky's story began to fall apart. Finally, she broke. Yes, she admitted. She'd been having an affair with David. Yes, she'd wanted Kay out of the picture. And yes, Christopher had killed Kay. But she framed it as though she'd had no choice, as though events had spiraled out of her control. According to Becky's statement to police, here's what happened. On the morning of March 25th, while Tony was at work and before the other children woke up, Becky told Christopher it was time. She'd been preparing him for this. She'd been talking to him about how Kay was the problem, how if Kay was gone, she and David could be together, how the family would be better off. Christopher, high on Xanax that Becky had given him, took a hammer and walked next door to 2029 Hot Springs Drive. He smashed the back door window and waited inside for Kay to come home. When Kay arrived at 8:30, carrying her McDonald's breakfast in her purse, she walked into her own home with no idea she was walking into an ambush. Christopher attacked her immediately with the hammer, striking her head repeatedly. When she fought back because Kay Parsons was no passive victim, she fought for her life. Christopher grabbed Derek's baseball bat from the garage and continued the assault. The beating was prolonged, brutal, personal. This wasn't a quick killing. Christopher beat Kay until she was unrecognizable, until she stopped moving. Then, to stage the burglary, he took her gold necklace and expensive watch. He also walked next door to his own family's house and broke in there too, creating the appearance of a random burglar targeting multiple homes. Becky had taken her other children to school during this time, giving herself an alibi. When she returned home, Christopher was waiting for her, blood on his face and clothes. "I took care of everything," he told her. According to the police affidavit, Christopher told Becky, "I beat the fuck out of her." Becky helped him clean up, hide the evidence, get his story straight. Then they both went about their day as though nothing had happened. Becky even went to the hospital to sit with dying Kay, holding the hand of the woman her son had just murdered at her behest. The shooting was staged too. The next evening, Christopher shot his own mother in the leg in that parking lot, giving her a superficial wound that would make her look like another victim rather than the mastermind behind it all. On March 27, 2009, 3 days after Kay Parsons was beaten to death in her garage, Rebecca Sears and Christopher Bowers were arrested and charged with murder, armed robbery, and burglary. Michael Sears, who'd been the prime suspect, was cleared. The glass in his shoe was explained. He'd walked through the crime scene area with other neighbors when everyone heard what happened. He'd been wrongly suspected, and now he had to live with the knowledge that his mother and brother were killers. Christopher Bowers confessed to the killing, though his version painted his mother as less culpable than the evidence suggested. He claimed he'd acted mostly on his own, that his mother hadn't really meant for him to kill Kay, but the statements from multiple witnesses told a different story. Sergeant Edmonds later said that Becky Sears was one of the most narcissistic women he'd ever encountered. She just suckered her son in. She plied him with material things. She plied him with drugs. She knew how much he loved her, and knew he would do anything for her. Both Becky and Christopher initially pleaded not guilty and were held without bond. They faced the death penalty if convicted. The case dragged on for 3 years. The evidence was overwhelming. DNA from Christopher on both murder weapons. Witness statements about Becky's desire to have Kay killed. Love letters between Becky and David proving the affair. And Becky's own confession. In May 2012, facing certain conviction and possible execution, both mother and son changed their pleas to guilty in exchange for life sentences without possibility of parole. Christopher was sentenced to life for murder, an additional life sentence for armed robbery, and 20 years for burglary, all to be served consecutively. He was 22 years old. Becky received the same sentences: life without parole for murder, life for armed robbery, 20 years for burglary. District Attorney Ashley Wright stated, "It is quite frankly one of the grisliest murders I have ever seen. Hot Springs Drive would never be the same. The neighborhood that had seemed so safe, so perfect, had been the setting for an unthinkable betrayal." David Parsons eventually remarried and continued to live in the family home, trying to rebuild a life for himself and Derek. Derek, who lost his mother at age 12 in the most violent way imaginable, joined the Marine Corps after high school, perhaps seeking structure and purpose after such trauma. Tony Sears divorced Becky following her arrest. The family was destroyed, scattered by the revelation of what Becky and Christopher had done. His family back in Pennsylvania was devastated. Her sister Olive Bigley spoke of Kay as a wonderful person, someone who lived for her family, who was always adventurous and joyful. They'd been on vacation together just the year before, jet skiing in Panama City, laughing about waves and motorcycles. Now Kay was gone, buried at Sullivan Heights Cemetery in Uniontown, Pennsylvania, far from the Georgia home where she'd thought she'd found safety. A memorial fund was set up in Kay's name at Wesley United Methodist Church in Evans, Georgia. The community held vigils. People locked their doors more carefully now, installed security systems, looked at their neighbors differently, because that was the thing that haunted everyone. It wasn't a stranger who killed Kay Parsons. It wasn't some random predator. It was her best friend. The woman she'd vacationed with, laughed with, confided in. The woman who worked beside her every day, whose children played with her child, who'd been welcomed into every aspect of the Parsons family's life. Becky Sears had smiled at Kay while planning her murder, had hugged her while sleeping with her husband, had sat by her hospital bed after orchestrating the attack that killed her, and she'd manipulated her own son into becoming a killer, feeding him drugs and using his desperate need for her approval to turn him into a weapon. Rebecca Bowers Sears is currently incarcerated at Lee Arundel State Prison in Alto, Georgia. She's now in her mid-50s, serving life without possibility of parole. She will die in prison. Christopher Bowers is held at Smith State Prison in Glenville, Georgia. He's in his mid-30s now, having spent more than half his life behind bars. He too will never be released. The case has been featured on multiple true crime television shows. Dateline NBC's Secrets on Hot Springs Drive, Investigation Discovery's Deadly Affairs and Unusual Suspects, Oxygen Snapped, in the series Mother May I Murder. The story continues to fascinate and horrify people because of its betrayal, its manipulation, and the sheer evil of using maternal love as a weapon. In Grovertown, life goes on. Houses on Hot Springs Drive have been bought and sold. New families have moved in, children play in yards, neighbors wave to each other. The physical wounds have healed, but the people who knew Kay Parsons, who watched Derek grow up without his mother, who remember the shock and horror of those March days in 2009, they carry those memories still. They remember that evil doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it smiles at you. Sometimes it invites you to dinner, loans you a cup of sugar, listens to your problems with apparent sympathy. Sometimes evil lives right next door, and you never know until it's far, far too late. Kay Parsons was 41 years old when she died. She was a devoted mother, a loyal wife, a hard worker, and a woman who believed in the goodness of people. Her murder was a betrayal not just of her life, but of every decent impulse, trust, friendship, neighborly love. And in a small subdivision in Grovertown, Georgia, on a street called Hot Springs Drive, people still remember her. They remember her smile, her enthusiasm at her son's baseball games, her kindness to everyone she met. They remember Kay Parsons, and they mourn what was taken from her. Not just her life, but her faith in the people she loved. Rest well, Kay. Your story will not be forgotten. So if you're still awake, I'd like to know which of tonight's stories gave you chills the most. Was it the first story, the second, or the third? Meanwhile, let's move on to our fourth story. Story 4. In the heart of mid-Wales, there exists a small market town called Machynlleth. It's the kind of place where everyone knows everyone else, where children play freely in the streets, and where doors are often left unlocked. The town sits nestled among rolling green hills, with ancient forests stretching toward distant mountains. In October of 2012, Machynlleth was home to about 2,500 people who considered their community one of the safest places on Earth. Among those residents were Paul and Coral Jones, who lived with their 3 children on the Brennygog housing estate. Their youngest child was April Sue Lynn Jones, born 7 weeks premature on April 4, 2007. Those early weeks had been frightening for the family. Little April spent her first days in intensive care, and during that time she suffered a seizure that left her with mild cerebral palsy affecting the left side of her body. Despite this challenge, April grew into a spirited, determined little girl who refused to let anything slow her down. By the time April was 5 years old, she had developed into a child who radiated joy. Her favorite color was pink, and her bedroom reflected this passion, painted in soft pink hues and filled with stuffed animals that she'd collected over the years. She shared that room with her 17-year-old sister, Jasmine, who adored her little sister despite the typical frustrations that come with such an age gap. April had an insatiable curiosity about the world around her. Her family would later recall that she simply had to be involved in everything. If you were watching a movie, April needed to watch it with you. If you were working on your laptop, she'd want to see what you were doing, perhaps have a turn herself. She was always smiling, always laughing, always interested in what was happening around her, though her cerebral palsy sometimes caused pain in her leg, leaving her crying on the stairs. Her family was always there to comfort her, to lift her up, to remind her that she was loved. That autumn of 2012 was like any other for the Jones family. October 1st fell on a Monday, and the routine was familiar and comfortable. April woke up in the pink bedroom she shared with Jasmine. She got ready for school, attended her classes at Desgol and Radmakinleth, the local primary school. Her parents, Coral and Paul, had a parents' evening scheduled that evening at the school, while April had her regular swimming lesson at the local leisure center. After swimming, April asked if she could invite a friend over to watch a film. Her parents agreed, and the two children settled in at the Jones home. As evening approached, the friend lived nearby on the estate, and as children often do, they grew restless being indoors. They wanted to play outside, to ride their bikes in the fading October light. Initially hesitant, Coral and Paul eventually relented. This was Mackinac. After all, this was their safe community, their protective bubble where children had always played freely. Around 7 o'clock in the evening, April climbed onto her small pink bicycle and rode out with her friend to play on the estate. The temperature was cool but not uncomfortable. Other children were out playing too. April was wearing her purple quilted coat, the one she loved so much. She was happy, smiling, pedaling her little bike around the familiar streets where she'd played countless times before. At approximately 7:15, a vehicle pulled up near where April and her friend were playing. It was a distinctive car, a left-hand drive Land Rover Discovery, the kind of vehicle that stood out in a small Welsh town where such cars were exceptionally rare. The driver called out to April. Her friend watched as April, showing no signs of fear or concern, rode her bicycle over to the vehicle and spoke with the driver. What happened next would change everything. The witness, April's young friend, saw April willingly get into the Land Rover. The child watched as the vehicle drove away with April inside, disappearing down the street. At first, there was no alarm, no immediate panic. Perhaps April knew the driver. Perhaps there was a reasonable explanation. But as minutes turned into an hour and then another hour, the growing dread became impossible to ignore. By 10 o'clock that night, April had not returned home. Coral Jones knew, with the terrible certainty that only a mother can feel, that something was catastrophically wrong. The frantic 999 call came through to emergency services. Coral's voice desperate and breaking. "Please, my daughter's been kidnapped." The operator, perhaps not hearing correctly over Coral's panic, asked her to repeat what she'd said. A neighbor took the phone, trying to provide clearer information. They described a big gray car, a man driving, a little girl who'd gotten in and hadn't come back. Within minutes, police were mobilized. Within an hour, the entire community was being awakened to the nightmare. The search that began that night would eventually become the largest missing persons search in British police history. Detective Superintendent Andy John coordinated the operation from the local leisure center, the same place where April had attended her swimming lesson just hours earlier. By morning, the response was overwhelming. Nearly everyone in Machiavelli turned out to help search. Friends came from neighboring towns and villages. Strangers drove in from as far away as Manchester, asking where they could help look. The search team spread out across the countryside. They combed through the neighboring hills, walked country lanes, searched forest trails. Shops closed so employees could join the search. Restaurants donated food and drinks to the volunteers who worked through the day and into the night, calling April's name across empty fields and dark woods. The description of the vehicle became crucial. A left-hand drive Land Rover Discovery was so unusual in that area that locals could think of only one person who owned such a car. His name was Mark Bridger, and he was well known in Machenlith, though perhaps not in the way anyone would want to be known. Mark Leonard Bridger had been born in November 1965 in Surrey, England, the middle child of a police officer father and his wife. He'd grown up in what seemed like an ordinary family, attended school, left with unremarkable qualifications. But by the time he was 19, he'd already accumulated his first criminal conviction for firearms offenses and theft. In the 1980s, Bridger moved to Wales, leaving behind his childhood home in Surbiton, London. In Wales, the pattern of his life became clear. He worked various jobs, never holding any position for longer than a year. He'd been employed as an abattoir worker, a hotel porter, a firefighter, a lifeguard, a mechanic, a welder. He'd fathered 6 children with 4 different women, including a brief marriage that ended in divorce. He accumulated more criminal convictions: criminal damage, affray, driving offenses, battery, assault. By 2012, Bridger was 46 years old and living alone in a rented cottage in Senres, a tiny village about 5 miles from Ashenleth. He had a border collie dog, and very little else. His girlfriend had recently ended their relationship, possibly due to his alcoholism. Some of his children attended the same primary school as April Jones, though none of them lived with him. On the afternoon of October 2nd, less than 24 hours after April disappeared, a police helicopter spotted Bridger walking his dog near his cottage. Officers were immediately dispatched to his home to determine whether April might be held there, still alive. What they found when they entered the cottage told a different story entirely. Despite Bridger not being home, the interior was swelteringly hot. A fire roared in the fireplace, burning intensely though no one was there to enjoy its warmth. The overwhelming smell of bleach hung in the air, so strong it was difficult to breathe. Every surface appeared to have been meticulously recently cleaned. These observations led to Bridger's immediate arrest. When officers took him into custody, his first words were chillingly aware. "I know what this is about." The forensic examination of Bridger's cottage would reveal evidence that sealed April's fate and Bridger's guilt. Traces of blood were found in the living room, in the hallway, in the bathroom. DNA testing matched that blood to April Jones. There was so much blood in various locations that forensic experts concluded April had suffered injuries from which she could not have survived. In the fireplace, investigators made a heartbreaking discovery. Among the ashes were 17 fragments of human bone, consistent with those of a young child. Scientific analysis suggested they were pieces of a skull from a younger individual. The forensic team then turned their attention to Bridger's computer. What they found painted a disturbing picture of a man whose inner life was far darker than his public persona suggested. His laptop contained an extensive collection of child abuse images. He'd saved photographs of young local girls, including images of April and her half-sisters. His browser history showed repeated searches for terms like naked young 5-year-old girls and France, British schoolgirl raped and murdered. Most chillingly, his computer held images related to famous child murder cases. There were photographs of Holly Wells and Jessica Chapman, the two girls murdered in Soham in 2002. On the very day April disappeared, Bridger had spent time viewing child sex abuse imagery and pornography. He'd also sent messages to 3 different women on Facebook, asking 2 of them if they wanted to meet up with no strings attached. The police had more than enough evidence to charge Bridger with April's abduction and murder, despite her body never being found. On October 5th, just 4 days after April vanished, the case was officially designated a murder inquiry. The following day, Mark Bridger was formally charged with child abduction, murder, and attempting to pervert the course of justice. An additional charge was added for unlawful concealment and disposal of a body. The search for April continued for months. The police officially called off the active search in April 2013, 6 months after her disappearance, though they maintained a reactive team ready to respond to any new information. In total, the search covered 32 square kilometers of varied terrain. There were 609 separate search areas combed by police officers, volunteers, mountain rescue teams, coast guards, and search dogs. Roughly 150 police officers searched every day, joined by 100 mountain rescue personnel, RNLI vessels, kayakers, and helicopters. Throughout those months, Machinlith transformed. The community, already close-knit, became something more profound in their shared grief. At the request of April's parents, the entire town was adorned with pink ribbons. April's favorite color, they hung from lampposts, storefronts, trees, and fences. Special vigils were held where hundreds gathered, holding candles and releasing lanterns into the night sky as a mark of respect for the little girl they'd lost. Then Prime Minister David Cameron issued a public appeal for information, calling April's disappearance every parent's nightmare. The case dominated British media for months, with updates appearing on the news every day. The nation watched as Quarrel and Paul Jones, displaying remarkable strength and dignity, made repeated emotional appeals for their daughter's return, even as hope faded with each passing day. Mark Bridger's trial began on April 29, 2013, at Mould Crown Court before Justice Griffith Williams. The proceedings would last 5 weeks, during which the full horror of what had happened to April would be laid out for the jury and the world to witness. The prosecution, led by Elwyn Evans QC, argued that Bridger had abducted April with sexual motivation, murdered her, and then gone to enormous lengths to cover up his crime. They described him as a fantasist who had spent years nurturing dark obsessions with child abuse. and murder, obsessions that finally manifested in the most horrific way possible. Bridger pleaded not guilty to murder, though he accepted he was probably responsible for April's death. His defense presented a story that would be repeated throughout the trial. He claimed he'd accidentally struck April with his Land Rover while driving, realized she was severely injured or dead, panicked, and put her in his vehicle. After that, he maintained he couldn't remember what happened due to a combination of heavy drinking, adrenaline, and raw panic. The prosecution systematically dismantled this account. Forensic collision investigators testified there was absolutely no evidence of any impact between Bridger's vehicle and a pedestrian. April's bicycle showed no signs of having been struck by a car. The Land Rover bore no marks consistent with hitting a person. Moreover, Bridger's behavior in the hours before April's disappearance painted a picture of predatory intent rather than accident. The jury heard that Bridger had attended a parents' evening at his children's school, the same school April attended on the evening she was taken. While there, he'd spoken to a 14-year-old girl for 10 minutes in what the head teacher later described as a strange and odd conversation. Earlier that day, he'd approached several other young girls. Throughout the trial, Bridger cut a complex figure in the dock. He was articulate and confident, passing notes to his defense team, occasionally weeping when the jury looked his way. When he took the witness stand, he was combative rather than contrite, often posing his own questions instead of answering those put to him by prosecutors. He repeatedly referred to little April in a way that struck observers as calculated and manipulative. One of the most harrowing moments of the trial came when the jury heard the 999 call made by Coral Jones. Her voice, raw with panic and fear, pleaded, "Please, my daughter's been kidnapped." The call captured the exact moment when a mother's world shattered completely. Bridger wept as it played, though whether from remorse or self-pity remained unclear. The most damaging testimony came from forensic scientist Emma Howes, who explained the blood evidence found throughout Bridger's cottage. She described how the pattern and quantity of blood suggested April had been lying on the living room floor, shedding blood. The distribution of blood traces told a story of violence that Bridger's accident claim could not explain. April's parents attended every day of the trial. Paul and Coral sat in the public gallery, sometimes holding hands, watching as the man who destroyed their family attempted to avoid responsibility for what he'd done. Other family members and friends filled the courtroom, their presence a silent testament to the community's support for the Jones family. On May 29th, after 5 weeks of testimony, Justice Griffith Williams concluded his summing up and directed the jury to retire and consider their verdicts. They deliberated for 4 hours and 6 minutes. On May 30th, 2013, they returned with their decision. Guilty. Mark Bridger was found guilty on all counts: abduction, murder, and perverting the course of justice. Justice Griffith Williams delivered his sentencing remarks with unusual directness and severity. He called Bridger a pathological liar and a pedophile. He noted that April had gotten into Bridger's car innocently and trustingly, and that Bridger had subjected the Jones family to his hypocritical sympathy throughout the ordeal. The judge sentenced Bridger to life imprisonment with a whole life order, meaning he would never be eligible for parole. He would spend the rest of his life in prison. In the public gallery, Coral Jones wiped away tears as the verdicts were announced. For the sentencing, April's parents moved to the ground floor of the courtroom, looking directly at Bridger as the judge's remarks were read. They later released a statement saying they were relieved by the verdict. After the trial, additional information emerged. Bridger had reportedly told a prison chaplain at Strangeways that he might have disposed of April's body in a river, specifically the fast-flowing Afondolas, which flows past his cottage before joining the River Dyfi near Machinleth. Police investigated but found nothing, and expressed doubt about Bridger's claims. They believed he likely scattered April's remains across the countryside near his house, ensuring she would never be found, a final act of cruelty toward her family. April's funeral was held at St. Peter's Church in Machinleth on September 26, 2013. Though her body had never been recovered, the 17 bone fragments found in Bridger's fireplace were returned to her family for burial. The coffin was transported in a white and glass hearse drawn by 2 white horses wearing pink feather plumes. The procession was followed by hundreds of mourners from Machinleth and beyond, all coming to say goodbye to a little girl who touched so many hearts in her brief 5 years. The impact of April's murder extended beyond her community. Coral and Paul Jones began campaigning for better protection of children online, specifically focusing on making it more difficult to find child abuse images through web searches. Their campaign was backed by national newspapers and gained significant momentum. In November 2013, both Google and Bing modified their systems to block results from searches aimed at producing child abuse images, a lasting legacy from April's tragedy. In August 2014, the Welsh government purchased Bridger's cottage for £49,000. The building had stood empty since his arrest, a dark reminder of what had happened there. In November of that year, bulldozers demolished the cottage completely. April's parents were present to watch the house from hell, as they called it, reduced to rubble. Mark Bridger was initially held at HMP Manchester before being transferred to HMP Wakefield in Yorkshire, one of Britain's most high-security prisons, home to some of the country's most dangerous offenders. He was classified as a Category A prisoner, the highest security classification. This meant every aspect of his life was monitored. He couldn't share a cell with anyone. He was denied privileges available to other prisoners. In July 2013, just weeks into his sentence, Bridger was attacked by another inmate with an improvised weapon. The assault left him with severe facial and throat injuries, requiring sutures from temple to chin that severed an artery. The attacker was reportedly attempting to force Bridger to reveal where he'd hidden April's body. In December 2013, Bridger launched an appeal against his whole life tariff. He dropped the appeal a month later, just days before it was scheduled to be heard. Motionless struggled to heal from the trauma. The community that had come together in such an extraordinary show of support during the search continued to support one another in the aftermath. Powys County Council established a specialist multi-agency recovery group to provide ongoing support to everyone affected by April's murder. This included counseling services for the 29 child witnesses who'd been interviewed by police, for April's former classmates, for Bridger's own family, and for residents who'd participated in the search. A counseling and drop-in center on the Brynigog estate saw a large increase in clients during and after Bridger's trial. The recovery group operated similarly to support provided after natural disasters, recognizing that the community had experienced collective trauma. In March 2014, First Minister Carwyn Jones awarded Macanlath the First Minister's Special Award, recognizing the extraordinary community spirit shown during the horrifying events of October 2012. April's parents helped present the award. The First Minister praised the inspirational unity, resilience, and support the community had demonstrated, noting that Paul and Coral had found much comfort from their neighbors during the darkest time of their lives. Reverend Kathleen Rogers, speaking on behalf of Macanlath, said, "April Jones in her very short life has left a lasting legacy to our community, and that is the true meaning of unity, compassion." For Coral and Paul Jones, life could never return to what it was before. Coral spoke publicly about sinking into deep depression after April's murder, about withdrawing from her other children when they needed her most. Jasmine, April's older sister, described how there was no home anymore. Just a broken family, a house of memories and items, and a broken family in this house. Over time, with support and determination, the family began to rebuild. The relationship between Coral and Jasmine improved significantly. The family found ways to honor April's memory while trying to continue living. Every year on April's birthday, Paul would place a pink ribbon on the mountains overlooking their home. Paul spoke of his lasting memory of April, describing an evening just a few weeks before she died when a double rainbow appeared outside their back door. April had come running out, squealing en fees. En fees, the Welsh word for rainbow. She jumped up and down with pure joy, pointing at the two rainbows arcing across the Welsh sky. That image of April's unbridled happiness, her capacity for wonder and delight, was what her father chose to carry with him. Tragically, Paul Jones passed away in May 2025 from a brain disease he'd contracted in 2018. His stepdaughter Jasmine announced his death, saying the family was in shock. A friend eulogized Paul as an amazing father, son, brother, and friend, noting that he was now reunited with April and his mother. The story of April Jones is one of innocence destroyed, of a community's extraordinary response to tragedy, and of a family's impossible grief. It's a reminder of how a single act of evil can ripple through countless lives, changing everything it touches. April Sue Lynn Jones lived for just 5 years, but her impact continues to this day. The changes to internet search engines that resulted from her parents' campaign have helped protect countless other children. The unity displayed by Macanlath became a model for how communities can support one another through unimaginable trauma. And April herself, The little girl who loved the color pink, who jumped for joy at rainbows, who wanted to be involved in everything around her, remains in the hearts of everyone who knew her and everyone who's learned her story. On what would have been April's birthdays, pink ribbons still appear throughout Machinla. They flutter on lampposts and fences. A gentle reminder of a little girl on a pink bicycle riding through a safe community on an autumn evening. Her whole life stretching before her, full of possibility and promise. That's the memory worth holding on to. Not the horror of what happened, but the joy of who April was. A 5-year-old girl with cerebral palsy who never let anything slow her down. A sister who wanted to be part of everything her older siblings did. A daughter who brought light and laughter to her parents' lives. A child who saw double rainbows and squealed with delight, jumping up and down with the pure, uncomplicated happiness that only children can feel. That was April Jones. That is how she should be remembered. Please, if you're still awake, let's move on to our last story. Story 5. This story takes us to the glittering world of the Hamptons, where million-dollar mansions line pristine beaches, and the elite of New York society escape the city's chaos. But beneath the manicured lawns and expensive cars, darkness can lurk in the most unexpected places. This is the story of Ted Ammon, a brilliant financier whose American dream turned into a nightmare. On August 30th, 1949, in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, a baby boy was born to Robert and Betty Lee Ammon. They named him Robert Theodore, though everyone would come to know him simply as Ted. His father worked as a pension coordinator at Shenango Furnace Company, and his mother was a homemaker. They weren't wealthy people, but they provided a stable, loving home for Ted and his older sister Sandra, in the modest community of East Aurora, just outside Buffalo, New York. From an early age, Ted showed something special. He was tall for his age, athletic, and possessed a natural charisma that drew people to him. But more than that, he had an insatiable curiosity and a mind that seemed to work faster than those around him. While other children struggled with schoolwork, Ted breezed through his assignments, always hungry for the next challenge. In high school, Ted discovered his love for music, particularly the trumpet. He would practice for hours, the bright notes echoing through the Ammon household. His parents encouraged his passion, never imagining that their son would one day move in circles where jazz legends performed at galas. He helped organize. When it came time for college, Ted chose Bucknell University, a respected liberal arts school in Pennsylvania. He arrived on campus in 1967, a time of tremendous social change in America. While some students were caught up in protests and counterculture movements, Ted found his place in the traditional structures of campus life. He pledged Phi Gamma Delta fraternity, where his personality made him a natural leader. His fraternity brothers remember him as someone who could light up a room, who never seemed to meet a stranger. Ted also played varsity lacrosse, his sophomore year, his tall frame giving him an advantage on the field. But despite his athletic abilities and social success, Ted's true passion lay in understanding how things worked, particularly economics and business. He switched his major from architecture to economics, fascinated by the mechanisms that drove wealth and opportunity. What happened next would become legend among his friends and colleagues. Ted decided he wanted to practice law, but he had no interest in spending 3 years in law school. So he did something remarkable. He hired a tutor and studied for the bar exam on his own. In 1973, without ever setting foot in a law school classroom, Ted Ammon passed both the New York and English bar exams on his first try. It was the kind of achievement that seemed impossible. Yet Ted made it look effortless. That same year, fresh out of Bucknell, Ted joined Bank of America's prestigious executive training program. It was there, among the ambitious young professionals learning the ropes of high finance, that he met Randy Day. She was smart, driven, and beautiful. Everything Ted was looking for. They fell in love quickly, married, and set off for London, where Ted had secured a position as a solicitor at Norton Rose Fulbright. For a kid from East Aurora, this was heady stuff. Ted was living in London, practicing international law, married to a woman he loved. But as happens to many young marriages, the pressure of demanding careers began to take its toll. Ted worked long hours, traveled constantly, and slowly the connection between him and Randy began to fray. After 9 years together, they divorced in 1982. It was amicable, or as amicable as these things can be. but it marked the end of Ted's first chapter as a married man. The divorce, however, opened a new door. At age 30, Ted made a pivotal decision that would change his life forever. He left law behind and joined Colbert Kravis Roberts and Company, KKR, a relatively small private equity firm that specialized in leveraged buyouts. This was 1983, and KKR was about to become one of the most powerful firms on Wall Street. Ted thrived in this new world. He had a gift for understanding complex financial structures, for seeing opportunities where others saw only risk. Within a few years, he was handling deals worth hundreds of millions of dollars. By the time he was 42, Ted had already made his first $50 million. He was no longer the kid from East Aurora. He was a Wall Street titan. But Ted never lost his down-to-earth quality. Friends and colleagues describe him as someone who wore his success lightly. He was generous, thoughtful, and had a genuine interest in making the world better. He served on numerous charitable boards, donated generously to causes he believed in, and created the largest scholarship fund in Bucknell University's history, a $15 million gift that would help countless students follow their own dreams. Ted also found time for culture. He became deeply involved with jazz at Lincoln Center, eventually becoming chairman of its board. He worked closely with Wynton Marsalis, the legendary trumpeter, sharing his passion for the music he'd loved since his trumpet-playing days as a boy. It seemed Ted Amon had it all: wealth, success, respect, and purpose. But life, as we know, rarely follows a straight line. On March 22, 1956, in the sun-drenched beach town of Laguna Beach, California, a baby girl was born to Marie-Therese Legay. The girl was named Generosa, after her father, an Italian sailor named Generoso, who, according to Marie, had swept her off her feet during a brief passionate affair before returning to his ship and disappearing from their lives forever. Marie raised Generosa and her older sister as a single mother, working as a church secretary to keep a roof over their heads. It was a hard scrabble existence, made harder by Marie's struggles with alcohol and the burden of raising two daughters alone. Young Generosa learned early that life was unpredictable, that people you loved could leave you without warning. When Generosa was 10 years old, her world shattered completely. Marie died of brain cancer, leaving the two girls orphaned. They were sent to foster care, where they were separated and shuffled between different homes. For Generosa, this was a trauma from which she would never fully recover. Years later, she would tell people that her foster family had been abusive, that she had been made to feel unwanted and unloved. The only constant in Generosa's life was her older sister. They clung to each other through the chaos, providing the only family either of them had left. But even that relationship would end in tragedy when Generosa's sister was killed in a hit-and-run accident. Now Generosa was truly alone in the world. Out of this difficult childhood, however, came a fierce determination. Generosa took the surname Ran from one of her foster families and resolved to make something of herself. She enrolled at the University of California at Irvine, graduating in 1981 with dreams of becoming an artist. She moved to New York City, the place where people went to reinvent themselves, to become whoever they wanted to be. But art didn't pay the bills, so Generosa took a job as a real estate agent. She was good at it. She had an eye for beautiful spaces and an ability to sell the lifestyle that came with luxury apartments. It was unglamorous work, showing apartments to wealthy clients who often treated her as invisible. But Generosa was biding her time, waiting for her moment. That moment came in 1983, on what seemed like an ordinary workday. Generosa had scheduled an appointment to show an apartment to a potential client, a successful young banker named Ted Amon. Ted never showed up. The next day, Generosa called him at his office, furious at being stood up. Her anger came through the phone in waves. But Ted, instead of being put off by this fiery woman berating him, found himself charmed. Here was someone with passion, with fire in her belly. They arranged to meet in person, and when they did, something electric happened. Ted was captivated by Generosa's artistic sensibility, her strong opinions, her refusal to be impressed by his wealth and status, and Generosa, for her part, saw in Ted everything she'd never had: stability, security, and genuine affection. They dated for 3 years, and on February 10th, 1986, they married in what friends described as a Cinderella story. Here was Generosa, the orphan who'd been shuffled through foster homes, marrying a multimillionaire Wall Street banker. It seemed like a fairy tale come true. Ted bought them a townhouse on the Upper East Side of Manhattan, and Generosa threw herself into decorating it with the passion she'd once reserved for her art. She had impeccable taste and unlimited funds to indulge it. She could walk into a nursery and order thousands of dollars worth of tulips without blinking. She renovated and redecorated constantly, always chasing some perfect vision of domestic bliss. But there was a shadow over their happiness. Generosa desperately wanted children, but she struggled to get pregnant. After years of trying, she and Ted made the decision to adopt. In 1992, they traveled to Ukraine, to a small village called Medvedetsy in the Mukachevo region, and there they adopted 2-year-old twins, a boy and a girl. They named them Greg and Alexa. Ted was thrilled to be a father. Friends remember how he doted on the twins, how his whole face would light up when he talked about them. But Generosa's relationship with motherhood was more complicated. She had grown up without parents, without a model for what a loving family looked like. Some friends noticed that she seemed uncomfortable around the children, unsure of how to connect with them. As the years passed, cracks began to appear in the Ammon marriage. Generosa became increasingly demanding, increasingly paranoid. She accused Ted of having affairs, hired private investigators to follow him. She would fly into rages over perceived slights, her temper becoming legendary among their social circle. Friends began to distance themselves, unsure how to navigate Generosa's volatile moods. Ted, for his part, threw himself into his work. In 1992, he left KKR to found his own company, Big Flower Press, which specialized in printing advertising inserts for newspapers. Under Ted's leadership, the company exploded in growth, eventually reaching nearly $2 billion in annual revenue. It was later renamed Virtus Holdings and went public in 1995. Ted's personal fortune grew to an estimated $100 million. But success in business did not translate to happiness at home. In 1999, hoping to save their marriage, Ted and Generosa made a drastic decision. They would leave New York, leave the pressure and chaos of the city, and move to the English countryside. Ted bought them a 22-room manor house in Surrey, England, a place where they could raise the twins in peace and reconnect as a family. It didn't work. Ted's business interests kept calling him back to New York. He would commute across the Atlantic, spending days or weeks at a time away from England, and Generosa, alone in their countryside manor, grew more suspicious. She became convinced that Ted was having an affair with a beautiful investment banker in New York, a woman friends described as looking like Gwyneth Paltrow. Generosa even believed this woman had given birth to Ted's child. Whether any of this was true remains unclear. Ted's friends insist he never mentioned any affair, but for Generosa, the belief was enough. Her paranoia deepened. She hired more private investigators, demanded to see Ted's financial records, and became convinced he was hiding hundreds of millions of dollars from her. By the summer of 2000, the marriage was over in all but name. Generosa moved back to New York with the twins, and in a move that would set everything in motion, filed for divorce. Daniel Pelosi was born on August 2, 1963, in Center Moriches, New York, a working-class town on Long Island that couldn't have been more different from the glittering world of the Hamptons just a few miles away. His father, Robert Pelosi, came from money. He'd been a banking executive's son with every advantage. But somewhere along the way, Danny had taken a different path. By the time he was an adult, Danny had racked up a criminal record that included multiple DWI convictions and prison time. He was married with 3 children, trying to make a living as an unlicensed electrician and contractor. Money was always tight, and Danny had developed a taste for the finer things in life that his income couldn't support. He was handsome, charming when he wanted to be, and always looking for the next opportunity. That opportunity walked through the door in the form of Generosa Ammon. In the fall of 2000, she had just filed for divorce from Ted and was looking for someone to supervise the $4 million renovation of a Manhattan townhouse. Ted had bought her as part of their temporary separation agreement. Danny showed up looking for work, and Generosa hired him on the spot. What happened next happened fast. Danny was everything Ted wasn't. Rough around the edges, unpretentious, dangerous in an exciting way. And Generosa, wounded and angry from her failing marriage, fell hard. They began an affair almost immediately. Danny, still married himself, quickly realized that this wasn't just any affair. This was his golden ticket. By Thanksgiving 2000, less than 2 months after meeting, Danny and Generosa's relationship had become impossible to hide. They were staying together at the Stanhope Hotel, a luxury establishment across from the Metropolitan Museum, racking up $1,500 a night on Ted's dime. Danny drove Ted's Porsche Carrera around the city, wearing expensive clothes Generosa bought him, living a life he'd never dreamed possible just months before. Ted, remarkably, didn't seem to harbor any personal animosity toward Danny. Friends remember Ted buying baseball tickets for everyone. Himself, Generosa, the twins, Danny, and even Danny's 3 children from his own marriage. It was an odd arrangement, but Ted seemed to accept it with grace. He just wanted to finalize the divorce and move on with his life. But the divorce was anything but graceful. Generosa's lawyers were demanding half of what she claimed was Ted's $300 million fortune. Ted's lawyers countered that his net worth was closer to $100 million. And even that had taken a hit from recent bad investments and the economic downturn following the tech bubble burst. The judge overseeing the case ordered Ted to pay $85,000 in monthly alimony while they negotiated the settlement. For Danny, watching all of this unfold, the math was intoxicating. If Ted and Generosa divorced, she might get $50 million, maybe less. But if Ted died before the divorce was finalized, Generosa would inherit everything. Ted hadn't changed his will, and if Danny played his cards right, he could marry that fortune. Friends of Generosa later reported that she had become increasingly vocal about her hatred for Ted. She would say things like, "I want to see him dead," and he got what he deserved. Whether she meant these statements literally or they were just the venting of an angry, bitter woman going through a painful divorce is something we'll never know for certain. What we do know is that Danny Pelosi had a particular skill set that made him uniquely positioned for what came next. As part of the renovation work on Generosa's townhouse, Danny had helped install a sophisticated surveillance system, but more importantly, he had installed a similar system in the East Hampton mansion that Ted and Generosa were sharing on alternate weekends as part of their separation agreement. This surveillance system was invisible to Ted. Small cameras were hidden throughout the house, all connected to a computer hard drive concealed behind a panel. The system could be accessed remotely through a laptop computer. Anyone with access to that laptop could watch in real time everything happening inside the house. They would know when Ted was there, when he was alone, when he was asleep. Ted had no idea he was being watched in his own home. October in the Hamptons is a beautiful time of year. The summer crowds have gone back to the city. The beaches are quiet, and the air carries the first hint of autumn chill. The massive estates that line streets like Middle Lane sit peacefully among their manicured gardens, the very picture of American wealth and success. On the weekend of October 20th, 2001, Ted Ammon was scheduled to spend time at his East Hampton house at 59 Middle Lane. The divorce proceedings were finally mercifully coming to an end. Just 2 days earlier, on October 18, Ted and Generosa had signed a custody agreement for the twins. The final divorce settlement was expected to be approved the following week. After months of acrimony and legal warfare, Ted could see the finish line. He arrived at the house that weekend alone. His 3 dogs, 2 golden retrievers and a chocolate lab, greeted him enthusiastically. Ted went about his normal routine, perhaps feeling a sense of relief that his long ordeal was almost over. He had his whole life ahead of him. At 52, he was still young, still healthy, still wealthy. He could rebuild, find happiness again. That Saturday night, October 20, Ted went to bed in the master bedroom. The house's sophisticated alarm system was set. The dogs were settled in for the night. Everything seemed secure, but someone was watching. Sometime during the night, an intruder entered the house. Incredibly, despite the alarm system, no alerts were triggered. The intruder knew exactly how to disarm it. They made their way through the dark house, past the sleeping dogs who apparently recognized the person and didn't bark, and up the stairs to the master bedroom where Ted slept. What happened next was brutal and swift. The intruder attacked Ted in his bed. There was evidence he'd been incapacitated first with a stun gun, leaving him helpless to fight back. Then came the blows, at least 30 to 35 strikes to his head with a blunt object. Possibly more. Medical examiners would later identify bruises and fractures that painted a picture of savage violence. Ted was dragged from his bed and beaten to death on the floor of his own bedroom. After the murder, the intruder did something very specific. They pried open the panel concealing the surveillance system's hard drive and removed it. They also removed the weapons used in the attack. Then they left, locking the house behind them and re-engaging the alarm system. It was almost as if nothing had happened. For 2 days, Ted's body lay undiscovered on his bedroom floor. On Monday, October 22, when Ted didn't show up for work and didn't answer his phone, colleagues in New York began to worry. This wasn't like Ted. He was reliable, always in communication. One of his business partners, Mark Engelson, decided to check on him personally. Mark chartered a helicopter and flew out to East Hampton. What Mark found when he entered the house would haunt him for the rest of his life. The dogs were frantic, hungry, and distressed. And upstairs in the master bedroom lay Ted Ammon's lifeless body, beaten beyond recognition, naked on the floor where he'd been murdered 2 days earlier. The scene was shocking, not just for its violence, but for what was missing. There was no forced entry. Nothing had been stolen. Ted's wallet, watch, and other valuables were all accounted for. This wasn't a robbery gone wrong. This was something else entirely. This was personal. The East Hampton Police Department was called, and within hours the investigation had begun. It would prove to be one of the most complex and sensational murder cases in the history of the Hamptons. News of Ted Ammon's murder sent shockwaves through the elite circles of both Wall Street and the Hamptons. This was the first murder in East Hampton in over 20 years, and it had happened to one of the community's most prominent residents. The media descended on the small town in force, and suddenly everyone was asking the same question. Who killed Ted Ammon? In the beginning, there were numerous theories and potential suspects. Some speculated about business deals gone bad. Ted had been involved in billion-dollar transactions, and perhaps someone bore a grudge. Others, noting that Ted had been found naked, whispered about a possible homosexual encounter gone wrong, though Ted's friends and family dismissed this as baseless speculation. But investigators quickly zeroed in on the most obvious suspects, Generosa Ammon and her boyfriend Daniel Pelosi. The motive was glaringly apparent. With Ted's death, Generosa stood to inherit an estate valued at approximately $97 million. Ted had never updated his will to reflect his marital situation, so despite the pending divorce, Generosa was still his primary beneficiary. It was one of the largest fortunes ever at stake in a Hamptons murder case. Then there was the matter of the surveillance system. Investigators learned that Danny Pelosi had installed it, which meant he had intimate knowledge of the house's security measures. He would have known how to disarm the alarm, where the cameras were located. And most damning, he could access the system remotely to see when Ted was alone and vulnerable. When questioned, both Generosa and Danny insisted they had solid alibis. Danny claimed he had spent the night of the murder visiting his sister, Barbara Lukert, in Center Moriches, about 40 minutes from East Hampton. He said he'd arrived around 1:20 a.m. and had left her a laptop, the same laptop that could access the surveillance cameras in Ted's house. Barbara confirmed her brother had visited that night. But Danny's story had holes. A friend of his, Christopher Perino, who had worked for Danny's contracting business, later testified that Danny had asked him to drive that night. Chris said they had driven to East Hampton in Danny's 1999 ID, a car Danny called the beach car. According to Chris's testimony, Danny had gone into Ted's house while Chris waited outside. When Danny emerged, Chris claimed he had blood on his clothes and told Chris, "I think he's dead." Danny's behavior after the murder also raised red flags. Shortly after Ted's death, Danny called his father, Robert Pelosi, with an odd question. If someone wanted to get rid of something, what could they do with it? Robert later testified that he'd told his son about how difficult it is to dispose of evidence in the modern age, about DNA, about dredges pulling things up from the ocean, about construction crews finding buried items. He said he never asked his son why he was asking. The hard drive from the surveillance system was never found. Neither were the weapons used to murder Ted. The interior of Danny's Audi was thoroughly cleaned and detailed shortly after the murder. Danny's leather jacket, which his sister Barbara said had something concealed in it the night of the murder, disappeared and was never recovered. But despite all this circumstantial evidence, the case moved slowly. Prosecutors wanted to be absolutely certain before bringing charges. They knew they were dealing with wealthy defendants who could afford the best legal representation. And there was one more complication. In the immediate aftermath of Ted's murder, Generosa did something that shocked even those who thought nothing could surprise them anymore. 3 months after Ted's death, on January 15, 2002, exactly 1 day after Danny's divorce from his first wife became final, Generosa married Danny Pelosi. The marriage was seen by many as an admission of guilt, or at least as grotesquely inappropriate. Here was a woman whose husband had been brutally murdered just months earlier, Now married to the man many suspected of being the murderer, Generosa moved with the twins into Danny's modest house in Center Moriches, a dramatic step down from the luxury she'd known. For a few months, the newlyweds seemed happy. Danny had achieved his dream. He was married to a multi-million-dollar fortune. He spent freely, drank heavily, and enjoyed his new status. But then came devastating news that would change everything. Generosa was diagnosed with advanced breast cancer. At 46 years old, she was dying. The investigation into Ted's murder continued as Generosa underwent treatment. The stress of the suspicion, combined with Generosa's deteriorating health and Danny's increasing drinking and spending, put enormous strain on their marriage. By July 2003, after only a year and a half together, Generosa had had enough. She left Danny and moved with the twins back to the East Hampton mansion, the very house where Ted had been murdered. As she lay dying there, Generosa made several crucial decisions. She cut Danny completely out of her will, leaving him only $2 million to cover potential legal fees. The bulk of her estate would go to the twins, and she appointed the children's British nanny, Catherine Main, as their legal guardian, and gave her the right to live in the East Hampton house for the rest of her life. On August 22, 2003, Generosa Ammon Pelosi died of breast cancer at age 47. To the very end, she maintained her innocence in Ted's murder. Before her death, prosecutors had offered her immunity from prosecution in exchange for testifying against Danny before a grand jury. She refused. With Generosa gone, prosecutors finally felt they had enough evidence to move forward. On March 24, 2004, nearly 3 years after Ted's murder, Daniel Pelosi was arrested and charged with second-degree murder. The trial of Daniel Pelosi for the murder of Ted Ammon began in September 2004, and quickly became one of the most watched trials in New York history. The courtroom in Suffolk County was packed every day with reporters, curious spectators, and most poignantly with 13-year-old Greg and Alexa Ammon, sitting in the front row to see their mother's former lover face justice for their father's murder. The prosecution was led by Janet Albertson, a tenacious prosecutor who painted a clear picture for the jury. Danny Pelosi was a con man and a criminal who had latched onto Generosa Ammon for her money, and when it became clear that Ted's death would mean instant wealth, had murdered him in cold blood. The evidence presented was largely circumstantial, but it was damning. The prosecution presented testimony from Christopher Perino, Danny's former employee and friend, who testified that he had driven Danny to East Hampton the night of the murder and had seen him emerge from the house with blood on his clothes. Chris also testified that Danny had asked him to help dispose of evidence, including the bloody leather jacket. Robert Pelosi, Danny's own father, who testified about his son's strange question about how to dispose of evidence the day after the murder. A former girlfriend of Danny's who testified that after his arrest, Danny had bragged about killing Ted, saying he enjoyed it. A cellmate of Danny's from when he was briefly detained on other charges, who claimed Danny had confessed to the murder and provided details that only the killer would know. The prosecution also highlighted Danny's financial desperation, his access to the surveillance system that allowed him to monitor Ted's movements, and his suspicious behavior after the murder, including cleaning his car's interior and disposing of evidence. The defense, led by attorney Gerald Sharjo, tried to create reasonable doubt. They pointed out that no physical evidence, no murder weapon, no bloody clothes, no hard drive had ever been found. They argued that Generosa herself could have been the killer, or that she had hired someone else to do it. They suggested that Chris Perino, who had been granted immunity in exchange for his testimony, was lying to save himself. Danny himself took the stand, a risky move that ultimately backfired. He insisted he was innocent, that he had been framed, that Generosa was the one who had wanted Ted dead. But under cross-examination, Danny's volatile temper emerged. He made threats, both veiled and explicit, toward the prosecutor and even toward the jury. His behavior was so concerning that additional charges of witness intimidation and jury tampering were later filed against him. The trial lasted 8 weeks. The jury deliberated for 3 days. On December 13, 2004, they reached a verdict, guilty of second-degree murder. When the verdict was read, the courtroom erupted. Greg and Alexa Ammon wept, finally seeing justice for their father. Danny showed no emotion, simply staring straight ahead. 6 weeks later, on January 25, 2005, Danny Pelosi was sentenced to the maximum 25 years to life in prison. At his sentencing, Greg and Alexa were given the opportunity to speak. Their words were heartbreaking. "I don't know how Mr. Pelosi lives with himself after what he has done to our family," Alexa said, her voice shaking. "I hope he rots away in jail." Greg, holding back tears, added that while he didn't have his father anymore, at least he had the knowledge that justice had been served. Danny was also sentenced to an additional 4.5 years for the witness intimidation charges he'd pleaded guilty to during the trial. As he was led away to begin his sentence, Danny maintained his innocence, shouting that he was a victim of the media and circumstance. The story of Ted Ammon's murder didn't end with Danny Pelosi's conviction. In many ways, the hardest chapters were just beginning, particularly for Greg and Alexa Ammon, who had lost both of their adoptive parents by the age of 13. After Generosa's death, custody of the twins became a bitter legal battle. Generosa had appointed their British nanny, Catherine Main, as their legal guardian, but Ted's sister, Sandra Williams, filed a petition for custody. Sandra argued that Kay Main was essentially a stranger who had no blood relation to the children, and that she, as their aunt and their father's closest living relative, was the appropriate guardian. The legal battle was complicated by the fact that Generosa's will left Kay Main not only custody of the children, but also the right to live in the East Hampton mansion for the rest of her life, plus $1 million. The will seemed designed to ensure the twins stayed with Kay, away from the Ammon family that Generosa had grown to distrust. For a time, the twins were separated. Greg went to boarding school while Alexa stayed in East Hampton with Kay, living in the very house where their father had been murdered. It was a surreal and traumatic situation for children who had already endured more than most people experience in a lifetime. But by 2005, Sandra Williams finally won custody, and the twins moved to Huntsville, Alabama to live with their aunts. It was a chance for them to have some stability, some normalcy, away from the media circus that had consumed their lives in New York. As for Ted's estate, which had been valued at nearly $100 million at the time of his death, the twins eventually inherited it, but only after massive chunks had been taken out by legal fees, taxes, and other expenses. One news report from 2012 revealed that nearly $50 million of the estate had been consumed by lawyers and administrators. Each twin ultimately received only about $1 million, a fraction of what their father had left them. The bulk of the remaining money went to various legal fees, to Ted's charitable foundations, and to the trust Generosa had established before her death. It was a bitter irony. Ted's fortune, built over a lifetime of hard work, had been largely consumed by the very legal battles that followed his murder. Danny Pelosi, meanwhile, was sent to Auburn Correctional Facility to begin serving his sentence. But he didn't quietly accept his fate. Over the years, he has continued to maintain his innocence and has made multiple attempts to appeal his conviction. In 2012, 7 years after his conviction, Danny gave several interviews from prison, including appearances on ABC's 2020 and Dr. Phil. In these interviews, he presented a new theory that Generosa had orchestrated Ted's murder, hiring Chris Perino to do the actual killing while Danny was kept in the dark. He claimed that Generosa had offered $50,000 to anyone on his crew who would tune up Ted, meaning beat him up, and that Chris had taken the job but had killed Ted instead. Danny's story had changed multiple times over the years, which seriously damaged his credibility. His appeals have been consistently denied. Legal experts who reviewed his claims noted that he had previously given sworn testimony that contradicted his newer stories, and that his history as a provable pathological liar, as one commentator put it, made his latest version of events difficult to believe. Chris Perino, through his lawyer, vehemently denied Danny's accusations. He had already served 6 months in jail for his role in helping Danny dispose of evidence, and he wasn't about to accept blame for the murder itself. As of 2025, Danny Pelosi remains incarcerated at Auburn Correctional Facility. He will be eligible for parole in October 2031, when he is 67 years old. He continues to maintain his innocence. Perhaps the most remarkable part of this tragic story is what happened to Greg and Alexa Ammon in the years following their parents' deaths. They could have been destroyed by the trauma they experienced, losing their adoptive father to murder at age 11, watching their adoptive mother marry the suspected killer, losing her to cancer at 13, being thrust into a custody battle and media spotlight they never asked for. But instead they survived. They thrived. They built lives for themselves that their father would have been proud of. Living with their Aunt Sandra in Alabama gave them the stable, loving home they desperately needed. Away from the spotlight, they could be normal teenagers, could heal in relative privacy. They finished high school, went to college, and slowly began to process the incredible trauma they'd endured. In 2012, when Greg was 21 years old, he did something extraordinary. He decided to make a documentary film about his family's story, called 59 Middle Lane, after the address of the East Hampton house where his father was killed. The film wasn't just about the murder, it was about their father, about who Ted Ammon really was, beyond the headlines. It was Greg's way of reclaiming his family's narrative, of ensuring that his father would be remembered for his life, not just his death. Through interviews with his father's friends, colleagues, and family members, Greg painted a portrait of a man who was generous, brilliant, and kind. The documentary showed the world that Ted Ammon was more than just a murder victim. He was a son, a brother, a friend, and most importantly, a father who loved his children deeply. Both twins have chosen to live private lives as adults, away from the media attention that consumed their childhood. They've honored their father's legacy by living with integrity and pursuing their own dream. They've broken the cycle of trauma and dysfunction that defined Generosa's life, choosing instead to embody the values their father represented. The East Hampton mansion at 59 Middle Lane, the scene of so much tragedy, eventually sold for just over $5 million in 2009, far less than the nearly $9 million Ted and Generosa had spent purchasing and renovating it. The new owners completely renovated the property, perhaps trying to erase the darkness that had settled over it. As you drift off to sleep tonight, consider the strange trajectory of this case. Ted Ammon had everything: wealth, success, respect, and a generous heart. He pulled himself up from modest beginnings to become a titan of Wall Street. Yet he never lost his humanity. He was beloved by almost everyone who knew him. Generosa Ammon had nothing orphaned. Abused alone and spent her adult life trying to fill that void with money, possessions, and control. Her deep wounds never healed, and her paranoia and anger ultimately consumed her. And Danny Pelosi saw an opportunity and took it, trading whatever conscience he might have had for a chance at wealth he could never have earned on his own. In the end, 3 people's lives intersected in the worst possible way on that October night in 2001. One lost his life, one lost her soul, and one lost his freedom. But out of this darkness came 2 remarkable young people who refused to let tragedy define them. Greg and Alexa Ammon are the real ending to this story, a reminder that even in the aftermath of terrible violence and loss, healing is possible, that love can triumph over hatred, that children can break the patterns of their parents and choose a better path. Ted Ammon died at 52, on the floor of his bedroom, murdered for money he would have gladly shared. But his legacy lived on, not just in the charitable foundations he created, not just in the scholarship fund that continues to help students achieve their dreams, but in his children who grew up to embody the very best of what he believed in. They say that money can't buy happiness, and nowhere is that truer than in this story. All the millions of dollars, all the mansions and luxury, all the status and privilege, none of it could protect Ted from the darkness that Generosa and Danny brought into his life. None of it could save Generosa from herself. And none of it could buy Danny the freedom he threw away. In the quiet Hamptons nights, when the mansions are dark and the ocean whispers against the shore, 59 Middle Lane stands as a reminder that evil can happen anywhere, that no amount of wealth can protect us from human cruelty, but also that justice, though it may move slowly, eventually finds its way. Tonight, let this story remind you that the things that truly matter in life, love, integrity, family, kindness, can never be bought or stolen. They can only be given freely, and they're worth more than all the fortunes on Wall Street combined. Thank you for listening to tonight's true crime story. Rest peacefully knowing that another story awaits you next time, ready to accompany you on another journey toward restorative sleep. But if you're still awake, don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss our next true crime stories. And until next time, stay safe and take care. Good night.